What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto was forced to fight Kakashi, Jiraiya, and Sasuke all at once? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description box to original creator of this beautiful creation. Naruto grinned as he made his way to the academy. Today was the first day of his new life, and he felt great. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the damn fox hadn't come back with him when he'd made his little trip into the past. True, the nine-tailed fox was sealed within him, but it was the nine-tailed fox of the past who as of yet didn't have any hold on him, and hadn't said one word to him as far as he could remember. Even better, that fox was sealed behind a barrier that was entirely intact and couldn't speak to him without his permission, as the fox of the future had been wont to do on occasion, which meant that there would be no annoying fox distracting him at the most inopportune moments, and giving him reminders of his past failures when he'd had enough of them already. He whistled a merry tune, the origins of which he'd long forgotten, as he stepped onto the academy grounds. After recovering from fainting upon seeing himself in the mirror with that plump baby face that he'd grown out of, he had raced through the village and discovered it to be exactly as he remembered it being when he was last this age. Right down to Maida Guy's insane morning workout routine that he'd previously completely ignored, and the glares from the village's other denizens. Now that he was back, he was going to fix everything he could, starting with that revenge-obsessed idiot that he would be pointing in the right direction before he could end up getting some sort of whacked-out guilt complex and swear to destroy Konoha. By the time he was done with Sasuke, Danzo and Madara were going to be in for one hell of a surprise. After taking his old seat in the crowded classroom where the team assignments would be handed out, he looked around. If he hadn't seen it for himself long ago, he wouldn't have believed that his friends had ever looked as young as they did now. The 4 years and change between now and then had made a great deal of difference in their appearances and, in some cases, their attitudes. He was so focused on the people he had grown up alongside and had fought alongside in the future that he almost didn't notice when Sakura shoved him out of the way to get to Sasuke. After growling in annoyance at Sakura, he turned to glare at Sasuke, who apparently didn't know a good thing if it stared him in the face, from a safe distance. He remembered what happened the last time, when he'd gotten in the boy's face to do so and had been knocked forward by a flailing arm. That moment would have still been burned in his memory had he lived to be 1,000. That was definitely not how he wanted his first kiss to go down, even if it had technically already had gone down that way. Come to think of it, he didn't want his first kiss with a woman to go down the way it had either. Having your chakras stolen by a mass of flying hair was definitely not on his list of fun activities. When Iruka arrived to announce the team assignments, he winced guiltily at the bandages that were mostly concealed by the Chunin's clothing. If he hadn't listened to Mizuki and stolen that damn scroll, one of the first people who had become precious to him wouldn't have almost gotten himself killed defending him. He wasn't sure what he would do if Iruka died like he had almost done that night. Iruka was one of the first people to be there for him, and had cared the most about him. Across the village from the academy, Kakashi wandered helplessly around the candy store he'd entered in hopes of finding a treat for Naruto. As he stared at the racks and stacks and boxes and overflowing bins, he felt slightly lost. While he knew that the boy was obsessed with ramen, he didn't know what else the boy liked, hence his dilemma. The day had started off with quite a bang, especially since the third Hokage had been so surprised by his early arrival at his office that morning, that he'd nearly had a heart attack, and he'd been forced to fetch a healer to make sure he was alright. When he'd turned up in the Sandame's office, he'd entirely forgotten that they had been supposed to meet about an hour or so after he'd turned up at Naruto's apartment so he could get a feel for the boy he was about to train. The boy who, at this point in time, he'd pretty much ignored for the last 12 years, unless he was on guard duty. He strongly suspected that arranging the meeting to take place in Naruto's apartment had been the Hokage's way of guilt-tripping him for not taking Naruto in when he had been kicked out of the orphanage when he was 5. At the moment he didn't want to pile that particular regret on top of all the others, so meeting in the office had had its upside, as he didn't want to see the boy's apartment ever again. The last time he had seen it, when he'd gone to pack away the belongings of his dead student, had been painful enough. Naruto was alive now, so he wouldn't dwell on that. He had a second chance with the boy and he would grasp it with both hands. Now if only he knew what kind of sweets the boy liked. Turning back to the task at hand, He examined a shelf of jars full of brightly wrapped hard candies in various colors and flavors, ranging from the rather exotic peppermint to flavors more common to the area, such as the bright green candies that tasted like a berry that only grew in the woods around the village, wondering which ones he should get. As he studied the jars, continuing to feel just as lost as he had been 5 minutes ago, he grew angry at himself for having ignored Naruto to the point that he didn't even know what foods he liked other than ramen, which he probably wouldn't have known about either if the boy hadn't constantly and rather loudly talked about it almost every time he had seen him from the first day he'd had him as a student. Finally, after giving it up for a lost cause, he left the store after purchasing a 15-pound assortment of just about everything he could think of, including a jawbreaker the size of an orange. He knew that the candy wasn't exactly healthy for a growing boy, but he also knew that nobody had ever done this for Naruto either. Iruka was probably the only person in the village besides the Hokage who would have been willing to do so, but he had opted to buy filling meals for the boy instead, and the Hokage couldn't risk showing such blatant favoritism for the boy, and therefore would have been unable to do so. Checking the time on the clock outside the bank, he noticed that he still had a while until it was time to meet Naruto again. Until then, he would be preparing another surprise for the boy. With that in mind, he headed off to one of the better quality shinobi tailors with a set of measurements he'd wished he hadn't known, and something he'd pulled from the box of Kushina's belongings that he'd been holding on to. Jiraiya strolled down the road to Konoha, making plans along the way. Considering the shape of his godson and favorite student's current apartment, he would have to find another one for the both of them to stay in until the Chunin exams, and subsequently the invasion that would give him a chance to strike at Orochimaru before he could destroy Konoha, took place. He didn't know what he'd been thinking in letting that boy stay in that apartment the last time around, except maybe that having a kid around would cramp his style and walk in at the most inopportune moment. There were no worries about Naruto walking in at the wrong time now, since he now knew for a fact that at the age of 12, Naruto would be wise enough to the ways of the world to know what a piece of cloth tied to the door handle would mean. How could he not, when he was able to use certain jutsus that involved either naked or scantily clad women to devastating effect at that age? Another reason to ditch Naruto's current apartment was that they could also use the extra spending money they would earn by subletting Naruto's place to whoever would be desperate enough to rent it. With his plans for his future living arrangements mostly hammered out, he turned to planning other things. Since he wasn't entirely certain exactly when Orochimaru had switched places with the ninja from grass, it would seem that he would have to find a way to sneak into the Forest of Death during the second phase of the Chunin exams to face him. Until the Chunin exams took place in several months' time though, he would be spending his time getting himself back into peak physical condition, and training Naruto how to defend himself from his former teammate as well as researching for his next book. That was all in the future. However, he would have to get to Konoha first, and he couldn't get to Konoha if the pair of terminally stupid bandits who just leapt out of a bush while he'd been letting his mind wander kept blocking his way. Tenzo nervously walked into the Anbu headquarters, passing a rather unusual drawing done in permanent marker which had never been removed for some strange reason. One of the captains had said that it was a reminder. A reminder of what, however, he had never learned as he had been absent on the day it had appeared during his first year as an Anbu, and nobody had bothered to inform him of where it had come from, assuming that he already knew. The reason he was so nervous at the moment was because he never asked for a leave of absence before, and wasn't entirely sure how his boss would react to him asking for one now. The fact that he would be leaving Konoha within months of the invasion, which had been masterminded by Orochimaru, who had used him as a test subject prior to being run out of the village, would cast unnecessary suspicion on him as well when said invasion came. He only had a couple months until Naruto went on the mission to Wave though, and therefore time was of the essence, meaning that he needed to find Tsunade and get the necklace from her as soon as possible. Finding her, however, was going to be only half, and the most time-consuming half at that, of the problem. Convincing her to put the first Hokage's necklace up as stakes in a bet as Naruto had would be the other and far more difficult half. While Tsunade's miserable luck at gambling was legendary, she'd never put the necklace up as stakes in a bet before the incident with Naruto, and he himself did not possess Naruto's almost impossibly good luck. Hopefully, the necklace wasn't cursed as it has long been rumored to have been, because he would be highly upset if he died before getting it to Naruto. Naruto internally debated over whether or not to put the eraser in the doorjamb again. On the one hand, he was somewhat irritated over being made to wait for Kakashi, especially since he had forgotten to pack a lunch in his excitement at actually finding himself in the past, and was now going hungry. But, on the other hand, it wasn't up to his current pranking standards, which were far higher than they had been when he was this age. The eraser would be a nice cheap shot that would relieve some of his irritation at yet again being made to wait, but he would be getting his revenge for that ass poke that would have been considered molestation if it hadn't been a jutsu tomorrow anyways. So, maybe instead of pulling something so juvenile, he should just add to the pranks he had planned, and get back at his perpetually tardy teacher for this then. In fact, that sounded like a better plan. Coming to a decision, he left the eraser at the chalkboard and started pacing around the room, ignoring the strange looks he got from his teammates the first few times he went up one wall, across the ceiling, and back down the other wall. After waiting for what seemed like half an eternity, Kakashi finally arrived. In actuality, it had only been about 3 hours, but it hadn't felt like that as he'd taken to pacing around the room in different directions, and had invented a game that had involved not touching the floor. The first thing his sensei did when he arrived was run over to him and start hugging the stuffing out of him. The hug was nice, heartwarming, exceedingly uncomfortable, and frankly, once the reality of who was hugging him like that set in, fucking creepy. Then, after letting him go and giving Sasuke a glare that, if looks could kill, would have left a smoking pile of ashes where the boy was sitting, he told them to meet him on the roof and disappeared. Knowing it wouldn't be wise to show off too many skills he shouldn't have learned yet, he followed Sakura up the stairs instead of sunshining after him. Finally, after half of an afternoon of waiting, the team was seated as they had been 4 years earlier according to his personal timeline, and they were ordered to introduce themselves. Kakashi was just as vague as he had been the first time around, though he had looked at him and smiled when he was mentioning his likes, and glared at Sasuke when mentioning his dislikes, which was new. The only point of departure that he could think of that could have conceivably caused these new events to happen, since he hadn't run into the man during his tour of the village earlier that day, was the eraser he'd placed in the doorjamb the last time around. If he had known that sticking that eraser in the door would have made such a horrible first impression, he wouldn't have done it the first time, as it apparently seemed to be the reason why Sasuke had become his sensei's favorite student instead of him. My name is Uzumaki Naruto. I like ramen. I especially like it when Iruka-sensei takes me to eat Chiraku for ramen. I dislike traitorous, revenge-obsessed bastards who decide to destroy an entire village because of the actions of a couple of its citizens, and the 3-minute wait for my instant ramen to be ready. My dream is to become the Hokage so I could be powerful enough to protect those who are precious to me, he said, bouncing in his seat when Kakashi had indicated it was his turn to introduce himself. That was unexpected, Kakashi said when he was finished, before turning and indicating it was Sakura's turn to introduce herself. As far as he could remember, Sasuke and Sakura's introductions were the same as they had been the last time around, with Sakura squealing over Sasuke and yelling about hating him, and Sasuke doing that whole cool aloof lone avenger act. After the introductions, which Kakashi had frowned over, the man once again informed the team of the unexpected survival test, handed them the forms that told them where to go the next morning, and warned them against eating breakfast as he had the last time as well before dismissing Sasuke and Sakura. Naruto, can you stay here for a minute? I have something for you. Kakashi said as he had turned to follow his new teammates. Okay, he replied, sitting back down and looking over the paper he'd been given as Kakashi disappeared. Considering how long the man liked to keep people waiting, he would give the man until he was finished reading the form he'd been given and then he'd leave, as there was no way in hell that he'd be willing wait the rest of the day for the man to return from whatever errand he'd been running. As he read the form that he'd been handed, he was glad that Jiraiya had sat him down and taught him to read properly when he had finally noticed that he was practically illiterate thanks to the caregivers and academy instructors who had never really took the time to teach him how to read, and left him to his own devices in that area, since he could actually read the paper this time instead of making educated guesses at its contents. This is for you, Naruto, Kakashi said the instant he returned when he was 2/3 of the way through the form he'd been given, giving him another hug and a huge bag full of what looked to be just about every kind of candy there ever was, including lots of the red ones like the one Choji had given him when they first started at the academy, giving him that bit of false hope before he learned that everything was going to be the same as it always was. As he looked at the bag full of candy that he'd just received, he felt like he was going to cry. If he hadn't dropped that eraser on Kakashi the last time, The man would have liked him right away and given him candy. Considering that, maybe he shouldn't set all of those traps and pranks he was planning on getting Kakashi with tomorrow. So, let me get this straight. Tenzo's Anbu squad leader said. You traveled back in time so you could prevent the fox brat from releasing the Kyuubi and, in order to do so, you need to find Tsunade the slug Sanin and get the first Hokage's necklace from her because it has the power to control the fox? Yes. Tenzo replied with what had sounded like complete honesty. Shaking his head at the tragedy that was unfolding before him, he scrawled, "Leave approved for mental health reasons," across his subordinate's leave request form. Up until now, Tenzo had been completely reliable, and had previously shown absolutely no signs of having been anywhere close to snapping. "Don't come back until you get your head straightened out, you hear me?" he said as he handed the poor man the paperwork he'd be needing. "You're a good man, and I'd hate to lose you." As soon as Tenzo left, he began grumbling about how it was always the best ones that went completely wacko as he began on the paperwork he would have to give to the Hokage to make Tenzo's medical leave official. An hour later, he left his office and made his way toward the Hokage Tower, passing the drawing that a 6-year-old Uzumaki Naruto had done on the infamous day that he had somehow managed to sneak into Anbu headquarters and make his way as far as torture and interrogation, where he had been caught drawing on a sleeping Morino Ibiki's head on his way out. He'd thought giving the kid the set of bright orange jumpsuits the next day had been a stroke of genius at the time. It had been supposed to make the boy easier to spot and therefore capture, and it had, for a while. Kakashi discreetly followed Naruto home, noting which candies the boy ate first and which ones he gave away to the local children who had started trailing after him when they'd realized that the boy had candy and was willing to share. Seeing as they appeared to be Naruto's favorite, he'd have to get more of the cherry-flavored suckers later, but first, he would have to buy Naruto some groceries so he would have something nutritious to eat as well since, if he remembered correctly, the only food the boy currently had that wasn't rotten was instant ramen. If Minato-sensei were alive right now, he'd be yelling at him for not doing something about the boy's poor diet, which had obviously contributed to his below-average height, and Kushina would beat the crap out of him the instant Minato-sensei was through. Once Naruto was safely in his apartment, and looked to be settling in for the evening, he made his way to the shopping district and entered the 24-hour market that catered to the needs of the local shinobi. Making his way through the store, he selected a wide variety of healthy foods that could be quickly and easily prepared by a 12-year-old child. After he left the store, he waited until Naruto was asleep and let himself into the boy's apartment, hoping that the memories of his last visit wouldn't overwhelm him and distract him from the task at hand. Once he was inside, he made his way to the minuscule kitchen area and started putting the groceries he'd purchased for the boy away, making room in the cupboards and refrigerator by chucking out any spoiled food he found. As he was doing this, a rather sleepy-looking Naruto who'd apparently been woken up by the noise he was making caught him in the act. "What the hell are you doing?" Naruto asked. "I noticed that you were practically out of food, so I bought you some groceries," he replied as he put a box of breakfast cereal into one of the cupboards. The boy's eyes narrowed in suspicion as he walked over and began inspecting the produce that was still on the counter. Finding nothing visibly wrong with it, he began carefully inspecting the canned goods in the next bag over. He then started inspecting the items that had already been placed in the fridge and cupboards. Apparently satisfied that the packages didn't appear to be compromised in any way, and that the safety seals had indicated that they hadn't been opened and resealed by ninjutsu, the boy moved towards an isolated corner of the kitchen. "How much did all of this cost you?" Naruto asked. When he had told the boy the cost, he'd looked surprised. "All right, what's wrong with it?" Naruto asked. "Nothing, why?" he replied. "I can't get even half as much for that price," Naruto said, sounding highly irritated. He was barely able to control his anger, and his guilt at ignoring Naruto's situation even after he saw some of it firsthand. He'd seen the fridge stocked with little more than mold and spoiled milk and the near-empty dresser the last time around. He'd seen how most of Naruto's furniture appeared to have been rescued from the curbside or the dumpster. He'd just chosen to ignore it. He wasn't going to ignore it this time though. He wasn't going to fail the boy again. He was going to do everything he could for Minato's son. "It looks like I'll be having some words with some shopkeepers then," he snarled, before he turned away and started angrily slamming canned fruit onto the nearest shelf. Even though he could have continued going, Jiraiya got a room for the night. At the pace he was going, He'd be back in Fire Country in a day or so and in Konoha in another 3. While he was traveling faster than most civilians could, he was not going all out despite the fact that he wanted to. If he went all out, anyone who was keeping tabs on him would wonder why he was doing so, and those he most definitely did not want to alert to the fact that he was aware of their plans could become suspicious. He still had time. There were still several more months before Orochimaru would bring himself out into the open, and therefore into a position of vulnerability. Hurrying up and waiting was not his style, and that was pretty much what he'd be doing if he ran to Konoha like he wanted to anyways. If he continued at the pace he was going, he would also have the peace and quiet of the open road in which he could plan before he found himself taking care of a loud, rambunctious 12-year-old when he arrived in Konoha 3 to 5 days from now. He would be changing things so he could save Konoha, and more importantly, save his godson soon enough. For now though, this town possessed a rather nice hot spring, and many of the girls he had seen on his way to the inn were rather attractive. A relaxing evening of research to take his mind off of things would not go amiss. Besides, people would find it quite out of character for him to stop at a town with hot springs and not visit. With that in mind, he left the room he'd rented and made his way to the hot springs. At this particular onsen, the men's and women's baths were separated by a wooden barrier. Instead of being discouraged, as most perverts would have been by the seemingly solid and impenetrable barrier that separated them from the heavenly view on the other side, he did as he had done several times before, and put some chakra into one of his fingers with which he then used to create a barely noticeable hole. He then carefully moved away from the hole that he had created and waited a moment to make sure that none of the women on the other side noticed the hole being made. No general alarm went up in those moments he'd spent waiting to see if it was safe. In fact, all he could hear from the other side were some excited whispers and a bunch of feminine giggles. Deciding it was safe, he made his way back to the peephole and then looked through it. Unfortunately, something appeared to be blocking it on the other side. Suddenly, there was a yell of, "Crap, all I can see is an eye." From the women's side of the baths, Kakashi prepared the box lunches for the bell test with a rather vicious grin that was well hidden behind his mask. No matter how today went down, it was going to end with Sasuke being tied to the stump, and he was going to leave him there. He roughly pushed the thought about how he'd done the same to Naruto away as he arranged the food he'd made in a somewhat aesthetically pleasing manner. He was going to do things right this time, and Naruto would live to see his 14th birthday and beyond. After the test, he would be going to the tailor's to check on the status of the second surprise he'd arranged for Naruto yesterday. Amongst the things he'd recovered from his former sensei's house after the Kyuubi attack was a tiny outfit that Kushina had been making for her baby. When he'd asked her about it once in the weeks before she and Minato sensei died, she had told him that it was a modified version of the outfits traditionally worn by children in Whirlpool. Remembering the outfit, he had come up with the idea of having a tailor create a nearly identical copy in Naruto's current size which didn't have pants that unsnapped, since Naruto had quit wearing diapers long ago, but had hidden pockets for concealing weapons, scrolls, explosive tags, and other useful items. Since blue and orange, which were the main colors of the outfit Kushina had made, appeared to be Naruto's favorite colors, he was reasonably certain that Naruto would like the surprise, as well as the other outfits he'd ordered that were based on the surprise. After pulling himself out of his musings over his plans for later, he finished with the boxes, and set a note on top of the cherry tomatoes in one box telling Naruto to eat them in front of Sasuke before sharing his lunch with him, should he choose to do so. Satisfied at a job well done, he picked up his alarm clock and headed out to the field where his team had undoubtedly been waiting for hours, being the somewhat conscientious students that they were. While he'd felt a twinge of guilt at making Naruto wait, it was overpowered by a vicious satisfaction at making Sasuke and his annoying fangirl do so as well. Despite the fact that it would just add more time to his students' wait, he headed to where his students were waiting for him after briefly stopping by the memorial stone to apologize to his old team for not showing up for the last day or so. Much to his surprise, only Sasuke and Sakura were there when he arrived. An exclamation of, "Crap, I don't believe it," alerted him to Naruto's presence a moment later. When he turned to look, he saw that the boy was racing towards the meeting point, sweating, and practically out of breath. His coat looked even puffier than usual, indicating that he was carrying something in it. Moments later, Minato sensei's son skidded to a halt 6 inches away from him and, since the team was more or less together, he explained the rules of the bell test. He was briefly disturbed by Naruto's grin at this point because, the last time he saw that particular smile, Kushina had gotten him with some water balloons filled with turquoise paint, and he still didn't know how the hell she had gotten the paint into the balloons in the first place. After giving the rules and preparing to get the test underway, he was briefly surprised when Naruto didn't attack him with a kunai right before he called a start to the test as he had the last time. But considering the fact that his jacket hadn't been filled with whatever it was currently filled with the last time around, he shouldn't have been. After he indicated that it was time to begin, Sasuke and Sakura ran off and hid in the same spots as they had the last time he'd had to suffer through this test, and Naruto stood in front of him refusing to hide just as he had last time. This time however, instead of attacking him right away when he pointed out that he should have hid, the boy very carefully unzipped his jacket. Thank God these didn't break. Naruto sighed in relief as he looked down at the contents of his jacket. I'd planned on giving one each to Sakura and the bastard, but I arrived too late to do so. Oh well. After that little statement, he was immediately on guard. There were very few breakable weapons that would cause that kind of reaction in someone. Just about all of them could put you in the intensive care unit at the very least, and Naruto was the only genin he knew who would be crazy enough and oblivious enough to the possible consequences to consider using them during this test. Preparing to dodge anything from a poisonous smoke bomb to an acid bomb, he was understandably confused when Naruto pulled an orange balloon out of his jacket. The moment of hesitation caused by him trying to process the situation and determine the potential lethality of the improvised weapon that Naruto had obviously manufactured himself had been long enough to result in him being hit point blank by a balloon filled with orange paint. As he was still trying to process what he'd been hit with because it had been the last thing he'd expected, he was rapidly hit by two more balloons while he rather stupidly looked down at the large orange splotch on his vest. Instead of pausing to laugh his ass off as he admired his handiwork as he expected the boy to do afterward, and as his mother would have done, Naruto made a dash for the bells. This move had of course been unexpected, and he barely dodged in time, and almost didn't feel the boy's other hand go into his side pouch as he was pulling away. Noticing his side pouch was much lighter as he began to retreat to a safe distance, he made a desperate grab for the boy's arm. Somehow, in a move that was too fast for him to see with his Sharingan eye covered, he ended up with only the boy's now empty jacket. Naruto was already several feet away holding his precious, one-of-a-kind, signed first edition copy of Icha Paradise. If he hadn't known that knowledge of how to do the Hiraishin had been restricted to the Hokage's guard after Naruto's father had died, he would have looked near the boy's feet for one of his sensei's special summoning kunai. Crap, it's an old one, Naruto said, turning the purloined book over in his hands as he examined it. And you've already read it at least twice. It looks like I'll have to get the bells the hard way since I can't threaten to give the ending away. The boy then stood up and grinned rather evilly before he ran off at top speed towards where the traitor Uchiha was hiding. Watching Naruto run, he could see that Naruto was nearly as fast as his father. Until now, he hadn't entirely believed the stories about the boy running rings around other Anbu operatives for hours on end, and had thought that the other teams had either been slacking off or exaggerating since he'd always been able to catch the boy within the first 30 minutes of the chase. Watching the kid run, he could now see why he'd garnered so much admiration for such a feat. Once Naruto reached the trees, he practically flew up the trunk of a rather stately oak like a squirrel and went across the small wood that surrounded the training field, leaping from tree branch to tree branch on all fours. As he watched, he found that he was having a hell of a time keeping up track of the energetic boy without revealing his Sharingan, which was somewhat amazing since the boy wasn't using any chakra to boost his speed whatsoever. Hey Sasuke, if you want a bell, you'd better keep this away from Kakashi. Naruto yelled as he threw his precious book into the clump of bushes where the traitorous little snake was hiding as he passed. The Uchiha boy barely managed to catch the book. When he did, the little bastard took one look at the lurid orange cover, dropped it, and kicked it into the bushes. Big mistake, very big mistake. He'd planned on using this test as an excuse to beat the crap out of the traitorous brat, but the little bastard had just made it a dozen times worse for himself. Nobody disrespects the book, nobody. The stupid look on the soon-to-be traitor's face when he saw him bearing down on him was absolutely priceless. So was the stunned shock when the Uchiha brat learned he wasn't anywhere near as strong or as talented as he believed himself to be. The boy was practically black and blue by the time the timer went off. After the timer went off, he tied the boy to the stump a bit more tightly than necessary. He didn't cut off the traitor's breathing or circulation, so he should be fine. After he gave his little, "You failed but, you get another chance after lunch as long as you don't feed Sasuke" speech, Naruto and Sakura did as expected and the team passed. He'd planned on passing them anyways since he wasn't going to ruin Naruto's dream by sending him back to the academy where he would be rejected by every other Jonin sensei who only saw either the damned fox instead of the boy or his reputation for being completely incompetent when he graduated again, and because he would be in the best position to deal with the traitor if he set one toe out of line this time around. The nearly useless Sasuke fangirl was just extra baggage as far as he was concerned. Once the genin were finished eating, he decided to ask Naruto the two questions that had been bothering him since the test. "Naruto," he said, getting the boy's attention. "What?" Naruto asked. "How exactly did you get the paint into those balloons?" he asked. That question had been bothering him for longer than the boy had been alive. He'd regretted not asking Kushina, because the woman had seemingly taken the secret with her to her grave. "Funnel," Naruto replied as if the answer were so obvious that even a 2-year-old would get it. "Can I ask you another question?" he asked. "Sure," Naruto said. "What exactly did you mean about threatening to give the ending of my book away?" he asked, wondering exactly how the boy had known the book's ending considering the fact that it was forbidden to minors, and the bookstores that sold it had seals to prevent said minors from purchasing copies of their own. Naruto gazed over his shoulder, looking as if he were trying to think of an answer. His eyes suddenly widened in shock, and he pointed to something off in the distance behind him. "Look, it's a flying purple people eater," Naruto yelled before turning and running away so fast that even Minato-sensei would have been left in the dust. That was too close, Naruto thought as he ran faster than he even thought possible. As he rounded a corner on his way to one of his better hiding spots, taking the ground route as going via the rooftops would have just about every shinobi in Konoha chasing after him because he looked guilty even though such a chase would be futile for most of them. He ran right into Yamato Taicho and sent the poor man flying. The pack the man had been carrying burst open and emptied itself, scattering a couple changes of clothes and a bunch of other supplies including a couple storage scrolls across and down the street. "Sorry ya. Sorry," he said as he helped the man up, briefly upset at himself for almost slipping up and relieved that he caught himself in time. He wasn't supposed to know Yamato Taicho or Tenzo or whatever the hell he called himself just yet. "It's okay Naruto, I know you didn't mean it. If you can help me pick my stuff up, I would appreciate it," Yamato Taicho replied. While he didn't wonder at how Yamato Taicho had known his name as everyone in the village did, he did wonder at the fact that the man was being polite towards him instead of screaming and swearing at him for running into him. But then again, Yamato Taicho was relatively laid back and wasn't really one for screaming at people. When he really wanted to make his displeasure with you known, he'd give you this creepy stare that made your skin crawl. Glad that Yamato Taicho was being nice and wasn't giving him that creepy-eyed stare that made his skin crawl, he raced around and started gathering the fallen items that had spilled from the man's pack. After piling the last shirt beside the bag, he started shaking the dirt off of it and folding it. "Are you going on a trip?" he asked, curious. "Yes, I have some business outside of the village that I need to take care of," Yamato Taicho replied. Soon, everything was packed back into Yamato Taicho's bag, and the man was on his way. After bidding Yamato Taicho farewell, he walked off in the opposite direction pondering about his day as he made his way to the hiding spot he had originally set out for. Like yesterday, today had been rather interesting. Last night, after he had confirmed the night before that there was nothing wrong with the groceries or the new rice cooker that Kakashi had bought him and refused repayment for after the man left, he had gone back to bed guilty about being so suspicious. Kakashi had never bought him groceries during the last time around however, but the man had brought him vegetables that had looked as if they'd been swiped from someone's garden a few times, so it wasn't like it would have been completely out of character for him to have done such a good deed. That morning, since he knew Kakashi wouldn't be showing up at the training field until it was nearly 11, he had decided to sleep in a bit. After getting up a half hour after he was supposed to show up according to the instructions he had been given, he had showered, and ate a leisurely breakfast. Feeling slightly guilty considering how nice Kakashi had been the afternoon before, he got out the funnel, the balloons, and the paint. The paint balloons had been only one of the numerous pranks he'd originally planned to set up at the training field before Kakashi arrived, but he'd nixed the rest of them because the man had been so nice to him, and almost hadn't done this one either. He'd been rather stunned when he'd shown up at 10:30 and Kakashi had already been present. He'd never arrived later than Kakashi before, never. When the bell test started, Sasuke and Sakura behaved exactly as they had the last time, or at least he thought they did, since he could only vaguely remember the specifics of the test. Instead of getting into a losing fight with Kakashi this time around though, he had brought out his arsenal of paint balloons. His gut had clenched in guilt when he threw the second and the third balloons before he made his attempt at the bells and came up with a backup plan based on his and Sakura's victory during the second bell test on the fly because Kakashi-sensei had looked so stunned when the first balloon had hit him. When Kakashi grabbed at him and caught the sleeve of his jacket after he'd grabbed the book in his weapons pouch, he'd shot out of the too large jacket that he'd picked for just that reason in a maneuver that had left one or two Anbu scratching their heads before they had caught on after he'd purchased his latest orange tracksuit. After noticing that the book he'd grabbed was one of Kakashi's well-worn favorites rather than a new copy, he changed his plan on the go as he usually did. Racing off at a speed he usually reserved for fleeing the scene of a prank, he headed to Sasuke's hiding place. He'd thought that if the two of them could play keep away for a while and get Sakura involved, Kakashi might get frustrated enough to hand the bells over as ransom. The team would then pass because of their teamwork, which was the whole point of the exercise. Instead of cooperating, the stupid, revenge-obsessed bastard had drop-kicked the book. Knowing Kakashi and how he felt about his beloved one-of-a-kind signed first edition volumes, much less his less expensive and more common backup copies that he brought on missions, that had been an extremely dangerous mistake. Kakashi, as expected, expressed his dislike of Sasuke's action in a manner that looked exceedingly painful for the Uchiha boy who had been on the receiving end of their sensei's ire. Sasuke had looked a bit like a raccoon when he'd finally been let up so he could be tied to the stump at lunch. When Kakashi started interrogating him after lunch about how he could have known how Ero Sennin's book had ended, he panicked since he had tried to stay as far away from said book and its companions as he could get when he was last this age. Knowledge of such literature would have been completely out of character for him at this point in time, and could potentially raise red flags that would get him caught. That panic had led to him yelling the first stupid thing that came to mind in a pitiful attempt at distraction and running off. As he'd raced towards a place where he could hide and hopefully wait until the potential fallout from his actions during the bell test blew over, he'd ended up running into Yamato Taicho, who was setting out on what looked to be a long journey, in the middle of town. Looking up now, he could see that he was at his pre-selected hiding spot, his feet having taken him here more or less automatically as he brought himself back to the present after mentally recounting his less-than-routine day in hopes of getting a handle on it. Less than 10 minutes after he'd hidden himself and started settling into what promised to be a long wait until Kakashi either forgot his little mistake or got distracted by something else, Pakun showed up, and Kakashi arrived a few seconds later. He knew that this was going to be bad. If that eraser had caused Kakashi to pretty much ignore him and foist him off on Ebisu at the first opportunity during the Chunin exams, then relations were going to be downright frosty because of the paint and the fact that he dared touch one of the man's most precious books. "There you are," Kakashi said, before he hopped up into the tree he was currently sitting in and sat down beside him while he was still frozen to the spot wondering how much worse things would be between him and his new sensei this time around. He scooted away and prepared to run. Kakashi didn't look pissed about his actions during the bell test, but he wasn't about to test that theory. "You're not in any trouble," Kakashi said as he put his arm firmly around his shoulders, effectively preventing him from escaping. "I know you're afraid that you'll be in trouble for reading a book that's meant for adults, but I understand that you were curious. As you know, the Icha Icha series was written for a more mature audience, and there were probably many things you didn't understand. If you have any questions." "Questions?" he asked, wondering where the rising feeling of dread was coming from. "Well, you see, when a man and a woman, or a man and a man, or a woman and a woman for that matter love each other very much," Kakashi began. "Oh dear God, he's giving me the talk," he thought as he began to try and squirm out from under Kakashi's arm. No such luck. Kakashi had him in a vice-like grip. This was obviously the man's idea of revenge for his having taken the book, and he would be forced to sit through all of it. "Please don't bring out the visuals like Ero Sennin did," Please don't bring out the visuals like Ero Sennin did. He silently prayed as Kakashi began to explain the purpose of foreplay. Sasuke rubbed his chafed wrists and sighed in relief after Sakura cut the wire that bound him to the post when she was reasonably certain that their new sensei was long gone. Before he departed, his new sensei had left him with a great deal to think about. The first of which was the fact that the man didn't seem to practically worship the ground that he walked on like his academy instructors barring Iruka, who treated all of his students based on their actual performance rather than their clan affiliation, had done. In fact, his new instructor seemed to hate him. After Hitaki-sensei had informed him that the team had passed when Naruto and Sakura had shared their lunches, which were sadly devoid of the tasty cherry tomatoes he'd watched Naruto eating with him, the man had told them that those who break the rules are trash, and those who abandon or betray their teammates are worse than trash. The man had been looking directly at him when he'd said that. After Naruto had run off rather than explain how he knew the contents of that dirty book that belonged to their new sensei and Sakura had left, the man turned to look at him as he struggled with his unusually complicated bonds which had resisted all attempts at the rope shredding technique. "Did you know it was an Uchiha who had told me that?" the man had asked after studying him for a few seconds. "Told you what?" he'd asked. "Those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash," the man had replied. He'd said non-committally, replying how he usually did when someone recounted a tale involving one of the members of his clan, usually to show their understanding of his loss. Obito gave his life for his teammates and his village during the war. The man had said, "When the time comes, would you do the same?" He'd given another non-committal, "Thought so. More's the pity since, when the older generation think of the Uchiha, the first thing that comes to mind are those amongst your clan who were willing to die for the village and risked their lives daily to protect its people," the man had said coldly before he'd turned and walked away, leaving him tied to the stump. He'd then spent the next half hour wondering if he would be willing to die for Konoha. If he did so too soon, however, he would never get his revenge against Itachi, and his clan would never be avenged. That vengeance had been his reason for existence for the past 4.5 years. Could he die for something as ephemeral as the village and a pair of morons that he disliked, knowing he'd failed in his quest? Would he be willing to die for Konoha after he'd avenged his clan? Feeling vaguely guilty that the answer to both questions seemed to be no, he brushed past Sakura without thanking her and headed home, ignoring her pleas for a date. During the week following the bell test, things had been interesting for Naruto to say the least. The morning after the bell test, Kakashi had given him an "even though you covered me in orange paint and took my book, I still like you" hug and a cherry sucker on the way to the team's usual rendezvous point. Learning that Kakashi paradoxically hadn't hated him for pranking him had taken a great deal of weight off his shoulders that he hadn't known he was carrying. After trying to sort out why this might be, he finally figured that Kakashi had decided to call them even after he had forced him to sit through the talk for over 2 hours. With a relieved smile over the fact that his sensei didn't hate him, he raced ahead so he wouldn't arrive after Kakashi again. Being later than Kakashi was just too weird for words. Iruka-sensei had seen that hug by some odd coincidence, and his reaction to it had been downright unusual. The minute Kakashi had dismissed the team at the end of the day's training, Iruka had come over and led him to a nearby park. When they'd reached the park, Iruka had led him to a relatively isolated spot and looked around as if he was afraid of being overheard. Once he was pretty sure that they were alone, he started giving him the lecture on the bad kind of touching that the old man Hokage had given him after a certain incident when he was 5. Naturally, he found this to be far more embarrassing than receiving the talk from Kakashi who, much to his relief, hadn't brought out visuals as Ero Sennin had when he'd given him the talk during their training trip. He'd been completely puzzled as to why he was receiving this lecture until Iruka-sensei had started asking strange questions about Kakashi. Iruka had thought Kakashi was one of those kind of perverts. The thought of Kakashi being like that had been too alien to process, so he did the only thing he could at the time. He started laughing and he didn't stop until he nearly passed out from lack of oxygen. It didn't help Kakashi-sensei's case any that Iruka-sensei knew him well enough to know his smile was a mask to cover his pain and loneliness more often than not, and that his laughter was often a cover for embarrassment and discomfort. Because he knew him so well, Iruka-sensei had taken his hysterical laughter to be a clear sign that there was something seriously wrong. Rather than taking his laughter to mean that the exceedingly uncomfortable conversation had just gone way past embarrassing and was rapidly heading off into uncharted territory as it had, Iruka had come to the mistaken conclusion that Kakashi had been molesting him and started seriously interrogating him. Seeing the look on Iruka's face after he'd told him that nothing had happened and that the hug he'd seen earlier that day had been an apology for making him sit and listen to the talk for over 2 hours when he'd tried to reassure him and tell him that things with Kakashi-sensei were fine, he knew he'd said something wrong. 2 hours? Iruka yelled. 2 hours? The lesson on biology as it pertains to human reproduction is only an hour long. What the hell was he talking about for the other hour? The other stuff. He replied, turning slightly red. During the talk from the day before, Kakashi had not merely gone over the purpose and basic mechanics of UAL intercourse as the academy had done during one of the lessons he'd skipped, but had given him the advanced lecture which included information on the prevention of unwanted pregnancies and the various diseases one could contract, as well as information on a couple of the not-so-basic positions. Aside from the lack of mortifyingly embarrassing visuals, the talk he'd received from Kakashi-sensei had been rather similar to the one he'd received from Ero Sennin on his 14th birthday. Being forced to sit through either lecture was an experience that he'd rather forget. What other stuff? Iruka asked, looking as if he were dreading the answer. You know, the stuff that's in those perverted books he likes to read. He mumbled, trying to end the conversation, not wanting to continue this discussion as he had wanted to forget the embarrassment of Kakashi's lecture and put it behind him. The look on Iruka's face when he'd stormed off at that point had been positively murderous. When he was called into the Hokage's office the next morning, both Iruka and a somewhat bruised Kakashi were there. Both men were dismissed upon his arrival, and the Hokage had set up a bunch of privacy seals before speaking with him. Apparently, after he'd stormed away the evening before, Iruka had beaten the crap out of a very surprised Kakashi, and had leveled some pretty serious allegations against him. After a long conversation with the old man Hokage during which he was practically interrogated about the talk, the hugging, and the gifts Kakashi-sensei had been giving him, he was finally released and Kakashi had been called in. After an hour during which he'd anxiously waited outside, afraid of what could happen to his sensei thanks to an unfortunate misunderstanding, the one-eyed Junin left the Hokage's office with an odd look in his eye and a book on parenting in his hand. When the old man Hokage had explained to Iruka that it had all been one hell of a misunderstanding afterward, his former sensei apparently didn't believe him because he had taken to following him every spare minute he had, and rather closely scrutinizing his interactions with Kakashi whenever he was in the vicinity. Jiraiya smiled as he finally reached the gates of a still-standing Konoha. The journey here both had and hadn't been arduous as the points that defined his trip depended on when one considered it to have begun, but he was finally home. What to do first? Find an apartment, talk to his godson, then do some research? Find his godson, get an apartment together, then research? Research and save everything else for later since the information he had would be spoiled if he moved too soon, meaning that it had to wait. What the hell had he been thinking? Research first, of course. He'd been walking all day and he wasn't in the mood to go tromping around town this late in the afternoon searching for either Naruto or an apartment or both. Plan decided upon, he went to find the small knothole in the fence on the women's side of one of the local onsen which had been there for generations. Naruto could wait for a while, as he'd waited for longer before, he could get a room at a hotel for the evening, and Orochimaru wasn't going to be here for months. Research came first. Tenzo sighed as he glanced around the bar. Contrary to the information he had been given, Tsunade wasn't there. Or she wasn't in the more public area of the bar at least. Maybe she would be found enjoying the unregulated gambling in the back room. Sighing, he made his way to the back where a slightly less than legit craps game was taking place. She wasn't in the back room. Time to check the next bar. Sighing in frustration once more, he left. He had spent a week drifting from town to town and so far his search had been fruitless, and it could take several more weeks or months of relentless searching before he found his target. At night, he had nightmares where he went searching from town to town practically forever, just one step behind Tsunade, failed to get the necklace from her in time, and instead of releasing less than a tail of the Kyuubi's power, Naruto ended up completely losing control and turning the completely freed Kyuubi loose on the helpless land of Wave. Kakashi practically melted at the look of appreciation in Naruto's eyes as he handed him the newly completed outfit that he'd just picked up from the tailor. It had definitely been worth the expense. All in all, the outfit which had been modeled on the clothes that the boy's mother had made for him wasn't half bad, and Naruto clearly appreciated it if the way he was turning around in front of the mirror was any indication. The loose, embroidered top that went down to just below Naruto's knees, as he'd apparently grown a few centimeters in the year between now and his death since the top was supposed to come to his knees, had several nearly invisible pockets hidden amongst the elaborate embroidered wave and leaf design, and had the full Uzumaki clan symbol rather than the general one for Uzushogakure that was on Naruto's old clothing stitched onto the back of it, nearly as large as the Uchiha fan was on the Uchiha Bratz shirts. The flame orange pants that went with the top weren't too tight or so loose that they hindered Naruto's movement like with the oversized tracksuit the boy always wore, even though the cuffs had to be rolled up. I had some extra tops and pants made in a similar style, though not nearly as elaborate as those. There's 2 orange, 1 blue and 1 green top, all with the Uzumaki clan symbol. There is also 1 other pair of pants in orange, 2 in blue, and 1 in green. He said as he held out another one of the bags he'd brought with him when he'd come to his student's apartment after leaving the tailor's shop. At this, Naruto showed his appreciation for the gifts he'd just received by giving him one of the flying tackle hugs he usually reserved for Iruka. Smiling behind his mask, he returned the hug. He continued to smile throughout the meal of instant ramen that Naruto had offered him afterward. That Naruto had been willing to share his precious ramen with him had been a clear sign that he had indeed been truly grateful for the gifts he had received. The instant he left Naruto's apartment building, Iruka stepped out of the shadows of a nearby alley and accosted him. "How did you know Naruto's measurements?" Iruka asked, not even bothering to mask his suspicion. "I measured him for his clothes for his funeral because you couldn't do it, and the Hokage didn't force you to." He thought his memories he'd been trying to forget had come unbidden. That day had been horrible. Iruka had been nearly as broken as him at that time, and possibly even more so. Naruto had been a bit like a son and a little brother rolled into one to the scarred Chunin, had been the first of his students to die, and at the hands of another of his students no less. In the state he'd been in, Iruka had been unable to face seeing Naruto's body again, and so out of the few people Tsunade could trust with the task, it had fallen to him to take the measurements. After he had refused to acknowledge the Hokage's summons 3 times, Shizune had come to his apartment carrying a black-edged storage scroll that had contained Naruto's body and forced him to get out of bed to do the task. His student, his fault, his responsibility. He would of course be telling the current Iruka none of this. "I checked his clothing size when I put away the groceries I brought him while he was out. I then measured a couple outfits in those sizes, added a couple inches for future growth so he didn't need new clothes right away, and gave my estimates to the tailor," he said, making up his answer on the fly. Iruka clearly didn't buy his explanation. Probably because all of Naruto's old clothes were oversized. He'd known his answer was a lame one the instant he'd uttered it, but it had been all he'd been able to come up with as he'd tried to tamp down memories that didn't belong now that he'd been given a second chance to make things right. Memories of things that would never happen again. The second Iruka lunged for him, he ran for it. Sticking around when the amino was like this was inadvisable. The man was at least twice as strong as usual when it came to defending Naruto, and was willing to protect Naruto both in life and in death. After the boy's funeral, the man had single-handedly stared down the mob that had come to object to the fact Naruto had been buried beside his father. Going up against Iruka when he was like this was pointless, and would most likely end with him being hospitalized, which he definitely did not need right now. He could understand Iruka's suspicions in regards to his intentions towards Minato-sensei's son. His sudden interest in a child he had gone out of his way to avoid for the past 12 years would seem highly unusual to anybody who knew him. But he just wished that Iruka would go back to being mad at him for something he had actually done. At least then, he would have earned the beating he was sure to eventually receive. Getting a drink and waiting for Iruka to cool off sounded like a good plan right about now. When he arrived at the bar, Maida Guy had come over to where Kakashi was seated by himself with the vague idea of challenging him to a drinking contest. From the look in Kakashi's eye as he swirled the drink in his glass, something was wrong. Considering the rumors that had been making their way through the ranks lately, he had a feeling that Kakashi's mood had something to do with Iruka's accusations. "What's wrong?" he asked his eternal rival when he reached the booth that the man was holed up in. Standing in front of his rival as he currently was, he could clearly see that now was not the time for such things as drinking contests. If, say that Hyuga you have on your genin team for instance, decided to betray Konoha and killed that clone of yours Rock Lee and you went back in time to prevent it, how would you react when you saw the Hyuga boy and Lee again? How would you treat your students knowing one could kill one or both of his teammates at any time and your time with Lee could be cut short all too soon? Kakashi asked, looking at him in a manner that indicated that his question was entirely serious, and that he was asking for an honest answer from a friend rather than a fun answer from his eternal rival. At first, the question threw him. Of all the things Kakashi could be upset about, that was what he had been brooding over. It seemed so completely random and off the wall until he thought about it for a second, trying to see underneath the underneath, as Kakashi was fond of saying. Now that he was looking beneath the surface, he could see that Kakashi clearly thought that one of his students was a danger to the others and believed that it would be a short time before said student murdered or at the very least seriously injured one or both of his teammates. Why would Neji betray Konoha? He asked, trying to get more information so he could formulate a response that could possibly help ease his friend's worries. He was offered power so he could get revenge for something that happened in his past. Kakashi replied, "Why would Lee die?" he asked, hoping for more clarification as Kakashi's answer to the first question had been vague enough to be a reference to either the Uchiha boy or the Jinchuriki, since both boys had events in their pasts that they could want revenge for. He thought Neji was his friend for some strange reason, and went to get him back. Kakashi replied sadly, looking into his drink once more. Still too vague. But then there were Kakashi's actions to consider. Iruka had accused Kakashi of being a pedophile because he had taken to constantly hugging the fox child, which was rather out of character for the man. There had, of course, been some raised eyebrows when he himself had started hugging Lee to show his support and appreciation for a job well done. He would have hugged his other students as well if they didn't run at the first sign that he was about to do so. Would Kakashi be more likely to hug someone he thought needed a reminder that there was someone there for them, or would he be more likely to hug someone he was afraid he was going to lose? Seeing as Kakashi wasn't really one for showing physical displays of affection, he honestly didn't know the answer to that question. Not knowing exactly which way to go on that question, he decided to consider what little he knew of Kakashi's students. The Uchiha boy had been the only survivor of the Uchiha massacre besides the perpetrator, was the top rookie of his year, and was known to be somewhat aloof. Aside from that, the boy was an almost complete cipher. He knew almost nothing about the pink-haired girl, and Kakashi had indicated that the likely murderer would be male. After a long series of pranks that had grown increasingly destructive as time passed, the fox brat had recently defaced the Hokage monument and had also rather recently gotten into trouble for stealing a scroll of forbidden jutsu. Both of those activities hinted at something much darker than the pranks they'd been passed off as. "So, is Uzumaki going to be a danger to anyone else?" he asked, wondering if he should warn his team about the boy who'd recently started showing up to talk to Lee and Tenten out of the blue. The crunching sound of Kakashi's glass breaking in his hand startled him, as did the way Kakashi was looking at him. The man's glare was positively murderous. "Why is it when there is trouble, everyone blames Naruto?" Kakashi asked coldly. "He is completely loyal to the village, his teammates, what few real friends he has, and almost none of them have repaid him in kind. Despite all that he has been through, Naruto would sooner kill himself than betray Konoha or his teammates." He decided it would be best to retreat at that point, as he'd apparently put his foot in his mouth. He'd obviously given the wrong answer and hit a seriously raw nerve in regards to the Uzumaki. Noticing that Asuma and Kurenai were sitting together at the bar, he indicated that he was going to head over and talk to them, before he practically ran off. "What was that all about?" Asuma asked as soon as he reached them. "The Uchiha boy has said or done something to make Kakashi believe that he's going to snap and kill his teammates," he replied, wondering how the hell he managed to miss such an important clue when Kakashi had been talking to him. Kakashi had used the member of one of Konoha's most powerful clans who had been wronged by family as an example of the possible murderer, and his most devoted student who had to overcome discrimination due to his so-called disability as the possible victim. His beloved student who had been considered a loser and the dead last back in the academy. The parallels were pretty damn obvious. Why was he upset at you though? Kurenai asked. He'd been trying to hint at it rather than say it outright, and I misread the clues he was giving me and guessed that he'd been talking about the Uzumaki boy. He replied. Why would Kakashi get so worked up about that? Kurenai asked. My father did offer Kakashi custody of the boy at one point after there was an incident at the orphanage he was living at the time which had resulted in the child no longer being welcome on the premises. There must have been a reason for him to do so, and it is possible that Kakashi was close to one or both of the boy's parents before they died. If he felt that the child of the person he had been close to was in danger, it would be quite likely for him to be upset. It also explains why he acts so out of character in regards to the boy. Asuma said thoughtfully. He only started showing affection towards the boy shortly after Mizuki attempted to murder him in an attempt to frame him for the theft of that scroll, probably out of guilt that he hadn't been there to protect him as he felt he should have. Considering the fact that Kakashi generally keeps people at arm's length, and the only other time I remember Kakashi going through a sudden personality change was after that teammate of his died, the incident must have severely shaken him. Asuma continued, looking down at his own drink contemplatively. Jiraiya was up bright and well. Not exactly early that afternoon. After giving his clothes a sniff test and finding them marginally acceptable, he dressed, declared himself ready for the day, left the room he'd rented the night before, and made his way out into the village. He purchased his breakfast, late lunch along with a newspaper at a nearby 24-hour Shinobi Mart after waiting in line for 10 minutes while a Chunin argued with the clerk about returning some kunai he'd purchased there the day before, apparently too blind to see the no refund sign the harried civilian kept pointing at. After wolfing down his slightly stale roll and gulping down the cup of lukewarm coffee, he turned to the apartments for rent section of the classifieds and circled several likely options. He then crossed off 2 of the circled selections after realizing upon further reflection that they were actually coded messages, one arranging a time for when a young couple would be eloping and the other from a ninja who was holding his teammate's dog for ransom. After he was done, he went in search of his future student since he planned on bringing him along when he viewed the selected apartments as the kid would be living with him. After he broke in and established that Naruto wasn't home, he headed out to Team 7's favorite training ground. Kakashi had been the first to greet him when he arrived as his genin had been much too busy training to do more than make an idle note of his presence as they continued with their tree climbing lesson. Jiraiya-sama, this is an unexpected surprise. Kakashi said, looking truly surprised. I just dropped by to see how my godson was doing, and if he was available to go apartment hunting with me. He replied, getting straight to the point. Will you be training him then? Kakashi asked in a rather guarded tone. Maybe in my spare time. I won't be removing him from your team just yet. He replied. Naruto, get out of that tree, there's someone I'd like you to meet. Kakashi called over to the boy, who supposedly hadn't learned tree walking until the disastrous mission to wave that his future student hadn't liked talking about according to the reports he had read and the scant accounts he had heard from the boy, rather than continue questioning him. He didn't know how it had happened, but Kakashi had seemed far more intent on training Naruto during the 15 minutes he'd watched Team 7 work than he had in Naruto's stories of the man and what little of Naruto's training he'd seen during the last time around. It was possible that back then he'd caught his student during a bad month and that Naruto had complained about Kakashi so much because he didn't think he had gotten enough one-on-one training from him and thought that the man was focusing on the Uchiha boy with whom he'd had an ongoing rivalry too much. This theory was more plausible when he considered the fact that after the training trip, the Hitaki had spent weeks helping Naruto master his elemental manipulation techniques and improve the Rasengan. Because Kakashi seemed so intent on training Naruto, he felt secure in mostly leaving him in the young man's hands for the most part. The fact remained that he needed to train himself so he could be prepared for the coming confrontation with Orochimaru. At Kakashi's call, the blonde-haired boy who wasn't in his ubiquitous jumpsuit, but rather wearing an outfit he'd never seen before which consisted of a green top with the Uzumaki clan symbol on the back and orange pants raced over looking excited. When he stopped a foot away from where he and the Hitaki were standing, he noticed that the boy had a mischievous look in his eye that swiftly vanished. Who's this Kakashi-sensei? Naruto asked, looking so much like his mother at that moment that he began to sweat. This is your godfather, the toad sage Jiraiya. He's been away hunting a missing nin for the last 11.5 years. Kakashi replied. Nice to meet you, Jiraiya. Naruto said, grinning in a manner which was more reminiscent of his father than his mother, which upped his panic level several notches since, while Minato generally wasn't one for pulling pranks, he'd learned the hard way to watch out for that particular smile the few times it had revealed itself. "Say Naruto, how would you like to stay in a better apartment for a while?" he asked. "Since I'm your godfather, I'm responsible for several things and your care and feeding is one of them, which I'll be able to tend to now since I'll be in town for some time, and will be needing a new apartment anyways." "What about my plans?" Naruto asked, not asking a single question about him or the apartment they'd ostensibly be living in. He had a vague feeling that he should find that to be rather worrisome, considering the fact that the boy was quite willing to move in with a person he'd just met, godfather or no. "You can bring them with us," he replied, knowing that that was the only response he could give in regards to the things. He remembered that Naruto's plants, some of which had lived in his apartment, and others of which had lived in a makeshift greenhouse on the roof of the building, had been the boy's pride and joy. Tending to those plants was one of the few hobbies that the boy enjoyed outside of training. The look on Naruto's face when he entrusted his plants to the few friends he had before he left Konoha for 3 years of training had been pitiful. "Okay," Naruto said, grinning brightly. And, with that, the matter of housing was settled as far as Naruto was concerned. All that was left was actually finding a place to live. Naruto smiled. Today had gone quite nicely if he said so himself. He had managed to get a certain cheap bastard who had a habit of emptying his Gama-chan rather than spending his own money to shell out for a 2-bedroom apartment, and Jiraiya had done something perverted enough during the hunt for said apartment for him to be able to start calling him by his old nickname. A nickname that the man hated just as much this time around as he had the last time. "Ero Sennin, what time should I start bringing my stuff over tomorrow?" he asked the second Jiraiya had finished signing the lease. "How many times have I asked you to stop calling me that?" Jiraiya said in annoyance. "5, he replied, knowing it had been many more before he had finally given up about a year and a half before he died. It had only been 5 in this timeline, however. "You can start bringing your crap over after you finish with your day's training." Jiraiya replied with a sigh. "I've got to go meet with the Hokage about something now, so I'll meet up with you later." "Wait a minute, he's going to be living here," the apartment manager said, finally catching on to what they had been talking about, apparently having been too absorbed in getting all of the paperwork in order before now to pay any attention to their conversation. "Yeah, the kid's going to be staying with me. I'll pay an extra pet deposit or whatever. It's not like he'll be a problem or anything," Jiraiya replied casually. There was a dangerous look in his eyes that belied his tone, however, and he was now playing with a kunai that he hadn't been holding a moment ago. The manager, who lived in a ninja village and was therefore forced to interact with ninja on a regular basis, especially since several of his tenants were ninja, was only barely cowed, which was rather commendable considering the Sannin's reputation. "But he's the manager weakly protested, cutting himself off before he said something that would get himself killed. "The 4th Hokage asked me to look after him before he died. I kinda got caught up in chasing after a certain traitor for quite some time, but I recently got my priorities straight and I decided to come back and keep my promise. If you make things harder for me," Jiraiya said in a slightly more threatening tone, no longer playing with the kunai which was still in his hand. Those had apparently been the magic words, as the manager had then swallowed all of his objections. "Fine," the manager said. "But, if he damages anything, you're paying for it." With that, Jiraiya grumbled as he paid the pet deposit the manager had taken him up on. When the Sannin was finished with the extra paperwork on which he had been listed as a pet fox, they both went their separate ways. As he was heading towards his apartment to pack, he ran into Iruka. Accepting Iruka's offer of ramen, he followed his best friend and first father figure to Ichiraku's. After they had arrived at Ichiraku's and made their orders, Iruka asked Naruto about his day. Naruto grinned and brightly and cheerily chattered at him about how he helped his teammates in the tree climbing exercise and how he had helped someone he called Ero Sennin find an apartment. "And I'll be moving in after training tomorrow," Naruto finished. He choked on his ramen when his brain finally processed the boy's final statement. "You're moving where?" he asked, hoping he'd missed something somewhere in Naruto's excited chatter that he couldn't always follow. "Ero Sennin's new apartment," Naruto said in a matter-of-fact tone before going back to inhaling his ramen. This was bad. This was very bad. First, Hitaki Kakashi had taken a rather inappropriate interest in his student, constantly touching Naruto every time he saw him. And now someone whose nickname roughly translated to perverted hermit had convinced Naruto to move in with him. Was the boy a pedophile magnet or something? The last time he'd tried to explain the bad kind of touching to Naruto after he'd seen Kakashi hugging the boy for an extremely inappropriate length of time before handing him a lollipop. The boy had stared at him blankly before he fell to the ground laughing. Despite this clear sign of distress, he knew what Naruto's happy laughter sounded like, and that hadn't been it. Naruto had denied that anything had happened to him, and continued to deny it afterward even though he'd seen any number of signs that something was going on. All of the circumstantial evidence he'd been able to gather since that day hadn't been proof enough of Kakashi's guilt according to the Hokage, who preferred to give Kakashi the benefit of the doubt where he would have launched a serious investigation had it been anyone else. Now, someone else had discovered and was seeking to exploit Naruto's vulnerability in this area since they had seen that Kakashi was being allowed to get away with such things. Since nobody else was willing to do it, it was up to him to protect Naruto from those who would exploit him in this and any other manner. Naruto, older men don't usually ask boys your age to move in with them unless they want something," he said, trying to remain calm, not wanting to upset or frighten the boy into silence. His first instinct, however, was to find the bastard who'd convinced Naruto to move in with him and eviscerate him before leaving his body somewhere public as a warning to others who might be contemplating following a similar path. "You think Arrow sentence A?" was as far as Naruto got before he fell to the ground laughing. While Naruto's laughter was amused on one level, it was tinged with serious discomfort on another, which was a clear sign that something was wrong and that Naruto was in distress. Apparently, something had already happened and he'd already failed to protect Naruto. As Naruto rolled around on the ground laughing, rather large man in his mid to late 40s or early 50s with unruly white hair held back by a custom hite with the kanji for oil on it and a pair of odd red lines running down his face approached Ichiraku's. He seemed familiar, but he couldn't place the man's face at the moment. "Naruto, I knew I'd find you here," the man said, watching in amusement as Naruto rolled around on the ground laughing in distress. Hi Arrow Senin. Naruto choked out between amused, disturbed laughs. "What's so funny?" the man asked. "Iruka-sensei thinks you're the other K kind of pervert." Naruto choked out before he dissolved into fits of laughter. The man stood there staring at Naruto in confusion. It was all the opening he needed. "Stay away from Naruto, you pervert," he yelled, kunai in hand, prepared to kill the man in order to protect Naruto. Tenzo wondered for the 5th time how the hell he'd managed to find himself running down a dark alley or as close to running as he could get supporting a wounded shinobi from Iwa. He would have to get the man medical attention in the next town over, as he was pretty sure that the local authorities were looking for the both of them at the moment. The last thing he remembered before ending up in the labyrinth of alleyways he was currently navigating was trying to avoid the knockdown drag-out brawl that was going on in the bar he had been vainly searching. He vaguely remembered seeing a flash of blonde and the swirl of an ominously familiar black cloak with red clouds and instinctively putting up a barrier to protect himself about half a second before the explosion. He had absolutely no idea how he'd managed to survive Deidara's idea of art after that, or where the hell he'd picked up the chunin from Iwa since there hadn't been any in the bar. All he knew was that he had to run, and that he had to get the guy he was half carrying some medical attention soon. Kakashi sighed as he looked down at his drink. He was making a disturbing habit of visiting the local Junin bar. 2 visits in such a short span were most definitely not normal for him, considering the fact that he'd previously had to be dragged here during a social occasion of some sort and had been able to count on one hand with fingers left over the number of times he'd been here in the last 3 years. It had apparently now become the place to brood when he didn't want anyone who might be looking for him to find him, however. When had he become jealous of Jiraiya? Why was he jealous of Jiraiya? He knew full well that his own apartment was far too small to keep Naruto in, and he couldn't rent a bigger apartment with his current income and spending habits, which included the care and feeding of several dogs who lived with him as often as they lived wherever it was they did when they weren't being summoned. Jiraiya, however, had the means to support Naruto comfortably. Sighing once again, he knocked back his drink and got up to leave, only to be stopped by a startled exclamation about the current bane of his existence. "Amino Iruka did what?" one of the people at the bar yelled after the person who had entered the bar as he himself had finished his drink had raced over to the man and said something. He paused in order to listen in, as whatever it was that the amino had done, it was sure to be interesting. Sarutobi Hiruzen, third Hokage of Konoha, felt like repeatedly slamming his head against his desk. It was bad enough that Iruka was in here practically daily commenting on how inappropriately Kakashi was acting towards Naruto, but the man had recently taken to attacking Jiraiya as well, and the fact that Jiraiya is one of the legendary Sannin didn't seem to faze the academy instructor in the least. On top of Iruka's overprotective behavior was the headache of Jiraiya actually fulfilling his duties as godfather towards Naruto. If he had known it would be this bad, he would have told the man to stay away from him, as he clearly had absolutely no idea as to how to properly raise a child. First, there had been the complaints that came to his office from the owner of the apartment building Jiraiya was renting a unit in, who had objected to Naruto's presence and attempted to evict him. The key word here being, attempted. The poor man soon discovered that the assistants he'd enlisted after the first failure were useless. There were Junin and then there were Junin, and if one of the legendary Sannin didn't want to cooperate. Then, there had been the angry Kunoichi who had found Jiraiya trying to convince Naruto to peek into the women's baths at the local onsen. After that, had been the bill he'd received from the owner of a local bar after Jiraiya loudly objected to the fact that they wouldn't serve Naruto due to certain laws that had been put in place in order to curb teenage alcoholism, and somehow ended up causing a fight that wrecked half the bar. Rumor has it that Iruka was somehow involved. All of these incidents had taken place within the span of 36 hours of his former student taking custody of the boy, and more reports kept coming in practically hourly, and naturally, all of these reports naturally added to the paperwork he had to deal with daily, which made his daily headache that much worse. He prayed that Konoha would still be standing by the end of the month. With the way things were going, however, it was quite possible that that would not be the case. Anger roiled in Kakashi's gut as he watched Naruto, who should have been asleep at that moment since he would be getting an early start later that morning, drag a drunken Jiraiya out of yet another bar. Though he would take Naruto in a heartbeat, especially now that he saw that even with his issues he'd be a much better guardian than that bum Jiraiya, it was practically impossible at the moment. If his nice little apartment hadn't been smaller than that dump Naruto used to live in, he would have offered to take the boy in on the day he had returned. With his current income though, he couldn't afford a larger place, and he had only barely been able to afford the gifts he had been buying the boy to make up for the 12 years he had pretty much ignored him. Normally, he didn't know how he felt about Naruto living with Jiraiya. While the man had been his sensei's Jonin instructor and had been named the boy's godfather by Minato sensei himself, he was highly irresponsible and had pretty much abandoned the boy for the last 12 years as well. Also, while Naruto was with him, he lacked the supervision and support that the parenting book the Hokage had given him said was necessary for a child's healthy development. Naruto seemed happy to be with the man he'd labeled Ero Sennin despite all of his faults though. That, and Iruka's attacks on him had tapered off quite a bit now that he had a new target to focus on. Fortunately, Naruto was capable of mostly caring for himself as he'd already done so for years, and hadn't missed any training since moving in with the bum a few days before. Today's training had gone as well as could be expected considering the team he had. The fact that Naruto constantly tried to help the Uchiha who repeatedly made it clear that he had no need or desire for assistance had been disturbing, and the worry that history would repeat itself started to gnaw at him as he watched Naruto keep trying to help. If Naruto considered the Uchiha to be more a friend than a rival, he would try to bring him back after he inevitably betrayed the village. This time though, he would try his damned hardest to make sure it wouldn't be Naruto laying dead on the ground in a puddle of his own blood. Tenzo smiled. Finally, after weeks of searching and several misadventures that he would dearly love to forget and would probably be reliving in his nightmares for years to come, he had found Tsunade. Now to figure out how to get her to put her necklace up as stakes for a bet. Smiling shyly, he tentatively approached where she was seated at the bar guzzling sake as if it were going out of style and carefully sat down on the stool next to her, trying to gauge her mood and the likelihood of her taking him up on an offer of a game of cards or something rather than pounding him in the dirt. After settling onto his bar stool, he ordered a drink to steady his nerves. Noticing that Tsunade's bottle was nearly empty, he offered to order her a drink as well. Not interested, Tsunade said. What? He asked. Whatever it is you're after, I'm not interested, Tsunade said. Tenzo growled in frustration. After coming all of this way, and suffering the things that he had suffered, there was no way in hell he was going to take, not interested, for an answer. He had to get that necklace, and he would do so if it was the last thing he did. Naruto frowned as he watched Sakura practically molest a resisting Sasuke at the end of their mission. Not only had the girl refused to help with the weeding because she hadn't wanted to get her hands dirty, but she had constantly fussed over Sasuke, whose body language had practically screamed "get lost" the entire time. No matter how much he tried, Sakura hadn't listened to him, and continued to behave in a manner he found increasingly more annoying with each passing day, as he found himself constantly comparing this Sakura with her older self, who was a much better ninja, and an all-round better person. He'd told the girl repeatedly since day one that Sasuke didn't like her actions, and wouldn't be interested in her if she kept pretending to be useless, when he knew for a fact that she wasn't, as he'd been on the receiving end of her blows enough times. The girl hadn't listened to him though, and if anything her behavior had gotten worse. With the way things were going, he guessed that it would take a serious wake-up call to get through to the girl the way the Chunin exams had done the last time around. It was possible that the fast-approaching mission to Wave would do the trick. Getting the mission shouldn't be all that difficult considering how he'd gotten it the last time, and the dates of that mission had been seared into his memory long ago, as had the dates of just about every major tragedy or disaster in his life. "So, who wants to get a drink to celebrate another successful mission?" he said cheerfully after dismissing his irritation at Sakura as it was non-productive. He'd asked the question as soon as they were out of Kakashi's hearing range after each of the D-rank missions they completed, and so far none of his teammates had taken him up on the offer. After asking the question so many times and receiving negative responses each time, asking had become more of a habit than a genuine offer. "Like they'd even let us in, moron. For the last time, stop asking," Sakura yelled and attempted to hit him, as she did almost every time he asked. She'd stopped it, "like they'd even let us in, moron," the first time he'd asked, and "stop asking" after the second. From her tone, he could tell that her response had become as routine as his invitation. More's the pity, since he was reasonably certain that Sakura would have a good time if she went for a drink with him once, as ninja bars weren't all about drinking, and more than a few establishments had easily throwable and easily breakable furniture, and one bar had afternoon tournaments that were popular with the local Chunin. Such group activities could only improve their teamwork, and if Sasuke had better ties to the village, he'd probably be less inclined to destroy it later on. He was halfway to his new home when he was waylaid by Sasuke. Much to his surprise, it had been because Sasuke had actually finally decided to take him up on his offer. Why, he had absolutely no idea. "So, how exactly are we going to get into the bar?" Sasuke asked in a conspiratorial tone, or at least one that was conspiratorial for him. "Meet me in the alley behind the restaurant with the giant chicken on it at 8, and I'll show you," he said. He hadn't known why the restaurant had a statue of a giant chicken on it, considering the fact that that was the one type of meat that wasn't on the menu, until Ero Sennin had told him when they had returned from their 3-year training trip. Apparently, the chicken, or rooster rather, was the symbol of a former shinobi clan that had fought alongside some seriously vicious roosters, the way the Inuzuka fought alongside their dogs that had opted to go into the food service industry instead of joining the ninja ranks after the founding of Konoha. Since they'd been a low-tier clan and much better at cooking than fighting, it hadn't been all that great of a loss as far as the shinobi forces were concerned. Out of respect for their former comrades, chicken was the one food that the clan refused to either serve or eat. Much to his surprise, Sasuke was actually waiting for him when he arrived at their rendezvous spot. Despite the fact that Sasuke constantly smelled faintly of alcohol for some strange reason that he hadn't been able to discern, going to a bar seemed as out of character for the boy as cross-dressing did. Today, the Uchiha boy would be doing both. After teaching Sasuke the clothed version of the Waijutsu, they headed off to a shinobi bar that he knew had a good enough reputation for being calm, quiet, and most of all relaxing, since he didn't want to start off with too much too soon, and Sasuke might be driven off by some of the rowdier places he himself was fond of. The owners of this particular establishment didn't overprice or water down the drinks, the bartenders weren't too surly, the bouncers didn't carry sharpened weapons, the seats and tables didn't have unidentifiable sticky spots on them, or worse, sticky spots that were identifiable and made you regret knowing what they were. And everything was bolted down so you didn't have to worry about getting hit by flying furniture during a bar fight. Flying drinks, however, were another matter. When the drinks he ordered for them, a potent beverage from grass that was called whiskey, arrived, he noticed that Sasuke didn't wince at the taste and didn't show any indication that he was hiding such a wince, indicating that this wasn't Sasuke's first experience with drinking alcohol. This of course was rather disturbing since Sasuke was a real 12-year-old as opposed to a time-traveling 17-year-old who'd spent a few years with a borderline alcoholic in a 12-year-old's body. It also explained why Sasuke had constantly smelled faintly of a brand of alcohol that he'd associated with cooking, despite the fact that Sasuke didn't seem to know all that much about cooking and didn't appear to enjoy the dishes it was commonly used in. Being perpetually hungover could also go a long way towards explaining the Uchiha boy's attitude as well. "You know, it's never a good idea to drink alone," he said to the boy as he mentally kicked himself for not spotting Sasuke's apparent problem before. Sasuke seemed to ignore his advice as usual as he gestured for another drink, without asking why he would say something like that or even making a sound of acknowledgement of his comment for that matter. Against his better judgment, he allowed the boy to order another drink and another and another. As he would discover several drinks later, rather than being one of those people who got angry when intoxicated, Sasuke turned out to be one of the worst sort of drunk for a ninja to be. He was the sort that started crying and spilling anything they were thinking about at that particular moment, including his entire life story. During the course of the evening, he learned several things that he never knew about his teammate, and they were that he hadn't imagined in association with Sasuke and had wished that he'd never learned, including the reason Sasuke really didn't like fangirls. Sasuke's aloofness and seeming indifference towards members of the opposite hadn't entirely been caused by the Uchiha massacre, though the massacre had been the incident that had set off part of it. He knew that in the other timeline, girls his and Sasuke's age had practically tried to molest the boy and that girls that were a little older had been slightly more aggressive in their pursuit of the Uchiha heir, but he'd had no idea it had been this bad. When people thought of that kind of thing happening, they usually pictured males doing it. He himself had had an experience with a caretaker gone bad when he was a child, but not to the extent Sasuke had apparently suffered, since that particular caretaker had been discovered and executed before there could be a second incident. Apparently, Sasuke had managed to get a couple of genin teams with some of the more aggressive pursuers on them as babysitters long before he was old enough to start thinking about such things, as well as 2 live-in caretakers who had decided to take their dislike for the former Uchiha clan out on him in small ways, such as forgetting to feed him on occasion, and 1 caretaker who turned out to be an aggressive pursuer with a taste for paralyzing drugs. Now that he'd seen under the surface of the Sasuke worship that had been going on after the massacre, he could see why Sasuke had been so willing to leave Konoha the last time around. Iruka had recently become obsessed with pedophiles for some strange reason. Maybe he should point him towards some real ones as well as a few child abusers. With his mind made up, he escorted Sasuke to his apartment and headed out to Iruka's place. Iruka finds real pedophiles this time, blazed across the front of the Konoha Times 2 mornings after the bar incident. Upon reading it, Sasuke was relieved that his name had been left out of the article entirely. He'd appeared in the newspaper's gossip column often enough already, and he didn't need to see his name associated with something that would most assuredly garner him even more pity, and give his fangirls more reason to want to fix him. He wasn't entirely sure whether or not he regretted going to the bar with his teammate because he'd run out of booze, but, considering the result, he couldn't exactly complain. He'd woken the morning before with a massive hangover and the overwhelming realization that he'd told Naruto things he'd sworn never to tell anyone. That evening, he learned about the earlier commotion near the local jail. Apparently, his former academy instructor had rounded up all 3 of the women who had abused him while they were supposed to be watching him, as well as a couple of the former genin who had done the same while they were supposed to be looking after him while his caretakers were away, and turned them over to the Anbu T&I division early in the morning after his trip to the bar with Naruto. The interrogations had been short, and all 3 women and both teenagers who were now fast approaching adulthood, but legally adults since they were shinobi, had been sent over to the jail before the end of training that day. He'd been called to the Hokage's office to give a formal report that afternoon, and had been informed that he would not be forced to give testimony in front of a full tribunal since the women had already confessed to abusing some civilian children that they had been tending to as well as him, so his name could be kept out of the investigation if he so chose. The commotion at the jail had been made by the angry parents of the civilian children who were calling for execution in this case, as in the case of the orphanage staff worker who had abused his charges 7 years ago. After such a trying day, he had naturally used the only method he'd found that kept the nightmares away, the method he'd learned when his first caretaker after the massacre had made him drink until he passed out because she didn't want to have to listen to his screaming. As a consequence, he would be nursing yet another hangover throughout today as well. Kaharu felt sick as she read the report on the Uchiha boy. 2 of the child's caretakers had gone days at a time without feeding the child who hadn't yet known how to fend for himself in that area, and one of them turned out to be ally abusive and she had allowed that to happen. She had thought his constant requests for new caretakers had been because he was a spoiled brat with impossible standards, and had allowed them to be treated accordingly. If she had known what was really going on, no child deserved this, not even the child of a pair of traitors to the village. Despite the fact that she didn't want to think such things of her old friend whom she'd grown up with, she had a feeling that Danzo had something to do with this, if only it was just knowing what was going on and allowing it to continue. The man had a vested interest in the boy, and therefore would have had extensive intelligence on who was caring for him. To allow those caregivers to be turned loose amongst the civilian populace after they were dismissed from their positions in the Uchiha household was unconscionable, and definitely not in the best interests of the village which Danzo claimed to espouse. She knew that the Hokage was not at fault in this incident, as the only orphan that the Hokage currently dealt with directly was the Jinchuriki Naruto. All others, even the last Uchiha, had a special committee to deal with their needs, and the sad truth was that Danzo most likely had his fingers in that committee as he did almost everything else. There had been things she would side with Danzo on over her teammate in Hokage, trusting that he had Konoha's best interests in mind. There had been things she had thought Danzo more capable of dealing with because she believed her longtime friend to be too soft-hearted to deal with them properly, such as the betrayal of the Uchiha who themselves had been planning to betray the village, but not anymore. If Danzo could knowingly allow even one of Konoha's children to be abused in such a manner on his watch for a reason that was completely non-productive, there was no telling what the man would be willing to do to Konoha as a whole. The Hokage sighed as he read the reports on his desk. Kaharu had come to him earlier with her suspicions in regards to Danzo, and he'd been disturbed to find his teammates' concerns about their childhood friend to be plausible. He couldn't quite believe that Danzo would allow such harm to come to the children of the village that he claimed to serve the best interests of, especially since it was completely unnecessary at best and counterproductive at worst, and none of the children were rude recruits. And, if these reports in front of him were correct, the blame for the abuse of the Uchiha boy wouldn't land in Danzo's lap. An external and apparently long overdue investigation of the special council that handled the affairs of the local orphans had revealed rife corruption that had gone on under his nose for years if not decades. Contrary to the neatly typed quarterly reports he had been given to look over 4 times a year, the orphans who weren't recruited to be soldiers en route were quite likely to receive substandard care from people who had little to no investigation done into their backgrounds, making it almost better for the children to end up en route rather than remain in the orphanages that had steadily gone downhill over the years as staff turnover remained high due to the poor pay. To make matters worse, the Orphan Council had also robbed the coffers in a most creative manner, cooking the books so thoroughly that they were nearly burnt, making it so that those who truly cared for their charges were unable to properly take care of them because of a lack of proper funding. Several years ago, he'd been assured that the incident that had happened with Naruto was an isolated one, that none of the other children had been in danger from the man who had decided to take his frustrations out on the demon. But that apparently wasn't the case. The incident regarding the Uchiha child that probably wouldn't have come to anyone's attention if Naruto hadn't had a mischievous streak a mile wide and gotten the boy drunk had revealed that the incident that had caused Naruto's permanent removal from the orphanage hadn't been as isolated as he'd been led to believe. He hadn't personally dealt with any of Konoha's orphans other than Naruto and Iruka, who had been left at his parents' house with a caretaker who dropped by to deliver meals since the boy was nearly an academy graduate at the time he'd been orphaned for years. Other than Naruto's orphanage, which he hadn't seen in 7 years, he had not toured any of the facilities where such children had been kept since his responsibilities as Hokage, Naruto, and his grandson had kept him much too busy, and he hadn't been given any reason to believe that the Orphan Council hadn't been doing their jobs. This situation was far worse than when the academy instructor Mizuki had turned traitor, and the damage that had been done in this situation was most likely irreparable in many cases. And it was partially his fault since he hadn't been keeping an eye on it like he should have been. After signing the orders for the ANBU to conduct raids on every last one of those facilities and for the T&I division to personally vet any and every person who dealt with the children living in those orphanages on a daily basis, he turned to the next request on his desk. Sighing, he signed Iruka's request to teach a special class on identifying a certain type of predator, wishing that it hadn't been necessary. Naruto had been curious when his team as well as teams 8 and 10 had been called back to the academy. After he'd arrived, he'd been positively mortified because he'd been forced to sit through a long lecture about the bad kind of touching and how to spot the warning signs when dealing with the sort of person that preyed on children. He'd squirmed when all eyes turned to him after the lecture. It seemed that there had been some rumors going around amongst his peers. Iruka's irrational behavior towards his Jonin instructor and his godfather hadn't helped matters any. "What?" he finally yelled. "Well, Naruto," Hinata said shyly, apparently unable to form much less finish her sentence. "If you're asking what I think you're asking about, the reason Kakashi-sensei's been hugging me all the time and giving me presents is most likely because he feels guilty that he's been living his own life instead of looking after me like he felt my parents would have wanted him to do, forgetting that I already had a godfather who should have been taking care of me himself and that they wouldn't have expected a 14-year-old to take care of a baby. The reason I haven't been living with Ero Sennin all along is because he's been away the last 12 years peeking into women's baths, writing perverted books, and keeping track of a child-murdering freak," he said, hoping that he'd cleared up some of the misunderstandings that had apparently been circulating. Several jaws dropped at this. "Child-murdering freak?" Inuzuka Kiba asked. "Yeah, the guy's name is Orochimaru. He was one of the legendary Sannin and Ero Sennin's former teammate. He kidnaps kids and uses them in his twisted experiments, where he turns them into freaky mutants if he doesn't kill them outright. He ran away from Konoha after they found about 100 dead kids in his lab, some of whom had even been dissected. Ero Sennin fought him when he ran and lost. Ero Sennin then decided to keep track of him as best as he could after that since he'd never been able to defeat him in open battle, and the bastard had threatened to destroy Konoha when he left. Since he didn't seem to be doing anything but sitting in his new lab for the last year or so, Ero Sennin decided it was safe to come back for a while until he gets news that the bastard has gone on the move again. He said, of all the horrified stares that surrounded him, the most important one was Sasuke's unsurprisingly well-disguised one. If Sasuke had known what Orochimaru was beforehand, he probably never would have joined him. At least that's what he believed of the Sasuke he knew, the Sasuke who had been his teammate, and had taken what had seemed to be a death blow for him, the Sasuke who, despite all that happened to him, still had a little bit of a heart left, the Sasuke whose eyes had not yet died, the Sasuke who had spared him at the Valley of the End when he could have easily killed him while he was unconscious, the Sasuke who still knew that sometimes power came at too great a price. He would do anything and everything in his power to make sure that his Sasuke didn't vanish again. If warning him about Orochimaru helped, he would post a sign 100 miles high. Tenzo was sore and exhausted by the time he reached the gates of Konoha. He had taken the most direct route and still ended up suffering through a couple interesting misadventures that he planned to do his utmost to forget entirely. He looked over his shoulder once more when he'd thought he'd felt an out-of-place presence. Once again there was nothing, just like the last time he looked. That didn't necessarily mean that nobody was there though. He had a sneaking suspicion that Tsunade had followed him home waiting for him to drop dead because she was just a little too honorable to knock him out and take her necklace back despite her numerous other faults. After all, he'd won it fair and square. He'd finally won the necklace in a 20-hour poker game that emptied her ready cash resources, and damn near doubled her personal gambling debt before she had finally and rather reluctantly put up her necklace. Giving a wan smile to the guard on duty, he signed in and headed to his apartment, tripping over the black cat that had been wandering around the village for as long as he could remember and somehow landing headfirst in a metal trash can full of things he really didn't want to think about, which he promptly knocked over along with the other cans in the row on his way. This had become par for the course, as the return trip home had constantly been like this. He couldn't wait to be rid of the necklace which he would be giving to Naruto tomorrow. For now though, he would be doing his best to clean himself off and getting some sleep. Sasuke sat across from a massive man named Jiraiya at the dinner table in Naruto's new apartment, wondering yet again why he'd come. After the lecture that had brought up a number of issues that he didn't want to deal with, Naruto had invited him over for dinner. Based on the boy's expression and the late hour of the meal, it seemed as if Naruto knew exactly how he was going to be getting to sleep that night, and wanted to make sure he didn't drink alone, or at all for that matter. He wasn't quite sure why he had accepted the invitation, since he generally tried to avoid getting close to anyone because everyone he'd gotten close to had hurt him somehow, even if it was simply by dying. That, and he was afraid of being tempted to kill someone he was close to get the Mangekyo Sharingan as his brother had instructed. Naruto was in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on the dinner he'd made because apparently, if the Uzumaki was to be believed, Jiraiya's cooking was something to be dreaded far more than that of a ramen-obsessed 12-year-old, and Naruto had wanted to spare him from the horrors of it. As he waited for Naruto to finish, he noticed several photographs that had been put up on the wall in what looked like a place of honor. One of the photographs was his team photo with Kakashi hugging a squirming Naruto in the middle, and him and Sakura off to either side. The photo to the left of it was of a blonde-haired man with blue eyes standing behind an ill-tempered Kakashi, a girl that may or may not have been an Inuzuka, and a cheerful-looking boy in orange goggles who was chewing on a senbon, with one hand on either boy's head. To the left of that was a picture of a much younger Jiraiya standing next to a boy with fluffy blonde hair that stuck out everywhere and blue eyes, and two other dark-haired children who were looking away from the camera. The picture to the left of that one was of a rather young-looking third Hokage standing behind a Jiraiya that was about half his age, a little blonde girl with brown eyes, and an oddly pale little boy with long black hair that had been left loose and gotten into his face. Before he could ask about the pictures that were obviously all team photos, Naruto set a meal that consisted mainly of tomatoes that had been prepared in several different ways before him. "I heard you like tomatoes," Naruto said by way of explanation before he set a similar plate of food in front of Jiraiya. Sure, he liked tomatoes, they were his second favorite food, but this was a bit much. As he picked at his meal, Jiraiya tried to engage him in conversation. Jiraiya, it seemed, had noticed him looking at the photos while they were waiting for their meal and had decided to tell him about them over dinner. "You obviously know about your team photo," Jiraiya said. "The one next to yours is Team Minato. My old student Minato was their instructor. Kakashi was already a Chunin when Minato had the 2 genin added so Kakashi could learn to interact with kids his own age. The boy in the goggles was named Obito, he died during the war. He was a cousin of yours if I remember correctly. He used to always show up late to just about everything, mostly because he was training or rather playing with your brother Itachi. I heard that the poor boy didn't speak for over a month after Obito died. The girl's name was Nohara Rin. She was a medic who was killed during a battle with a large number of ninja from Kiri. The picture next to that is the team I trained." Jiraiya continued. "The blonde, as you can tell, was Minato. The other 2 died at the beginning of the Third Shinobi War. The picture next to that is my old genin team. There's me, Hiruzen Sensei, Tsunade's the girl, and Orochimaru's the creepy-looking boy. Tsunade became one of the best medic nin in the elemental countries, before she broke after the death of her fiancé and left. Orochimaru left Konoha after he was caught kidnapping fellow shinobi and some civilians and doing experiments on them. They found about 100 dead children in his lab, as well as a bunch more that needed to be put out of their misery because of what he'd done to them. Sasuke lost his appetite then and there. Naruto had told him about Orochimaru earlier after Iruka had dragged them all back to the academy for a lecture on UAL abuse and the various ways that pedophiles trick children into certain situations. A lecture he hadn't needed, since he'd already experienced it. Jiraiya observed the rather bored-looking Uchiha whose eyes were wandering around the dining area. He'd never really known the boy as he'd not been close to Fugaku or Makoto, had been away from Konoha for most of the boy's life, and he hadn't really interacted with the Uchiha after he'd returned. He'd heard about him from Naruto, who had vowed to bring him back from the clutches of his former teammate, but it was all general stuff that everybody knew, and it didn't give him a clear image of the child Naruto seemed to regard as a brother. Seeing that the boy had taken an interest in the team photos that he and Naruto had put up on the wall when they moved in, he decided to give him some history about them and some information about Orochimaru so he wouldn't be going into the deal blind as he seemed to have the last time, thinking he could use the snake to get the power he needed to get his revenge. That had been a rather half-baked plan that had backfired and cost the boy and Konoha dearly. The boy had lost his body, and the village had been destroyed. When dinner was served, the Uchiha boy picked at his meal, which was rather surprising since he heard that tomatoes were his favorite food, and Naruto was an excellent cook despite his age and propensity for instant ramen. Something was obviously wrong with the boy. Naruto probably knew what was going through the boy's mind, since he knew him much better than he did. He would ask him later. Deciding to enjoy his meal and shelve the enigma that was Uchiha Sasuke for now, he went back to his food. Kakashi sat in his room thinking as he munched on a ration bar since he couldn't be bothered to cook that evening. He'd been forced to rethink what he knew about the Uchiha brat. If it had been any other child, a child that didn't have a trauma like the massacre in his past, he probably would have noticed the signs, and would have interrogated any other child about possible abuse if they displayed the behavior that boy did. After the arrests that made Iruka the hero of the hour, he had taken to observing the little traitor. What he saw surprised him. He couldn't believe that he'd missed this the last time around, especially considering the fact that he'd taken the brat for a month of one-on-one training. The kid was an alcoholic. The boy had drank himself to sleep every night he'd observed him. This wasn't exactly a unique occurrence even though laws had been put in place in hopes of preventing it. There had been more than a few alcoholics in his age group when he was the traitor's age, children who had started drinking either because it had been forbidden or in imitation of the adults around them and didn't stop as it had become a crutch that helped them avoid their problems, children who couldn't deal with the life they led and the war they were forced to fight. He might have become one of them himself if it hadn't been for Minato-sensei, and if he had, he would have been just another statistic by now since the ones who had turned to alcohol to deal with their problems had almost invariably died far too young. A person couldn't afford to make mistakes or have their senses dulled in any way in their profession. Doing so would be inviting death, which was probably why many of the older shinobi drank the way they did. After learning of the Uchiha boy's problem, he investigated as to how the boy was getting his supply. Apparently, the clerk at the nearby liquor store had believed the Uchiha's "I'm running an errand for" story every time since the brat had taken to purchasing cooking alcohol rather than the more common brands that kids tended to try to get their hands on, and this had been going on for a couple of years. Upon learning this, he'd set the clerk straight and alerted the managers of every other store in the area that Uchiha Sasuke wasn't allowed to buy alcohol from them until he reached the age at which civilians attained majority, which was 18. Hopefully by then, he would have found a way to deal with the problem and the Uchiha would have been weaned of his addiction. He didn't know how he was going to get the Uchiha boy to stop drinking, but he was sure he'd be able to find a way. Perhaps he should look into asking Jiraiya about some seals. Kakashi wondered at the strange feeling of déjà vu he had gotten when Naruto threw a fit after they had finished capturing that mangy cat Tora, who would be some other team's problem as soon as its owner's back was turned. Naruto rarely behaved like that this time around since he was actually getting positive attention and therefore didn't need to behave like a brat just to get people to interact with him, and he couldn't see why he was doing so now. He'd never really complained about the D ranks that the team had been placed on this time around, and seemed happy to be doing them as long as they didn't involve hunting felines that were on the lam. When he pulled out of his musings on Naruto's odd behavior, it was to find that Iruka was giving Naruto a rather familiar lecture on how missions were handed out and why he wasn't going to get anything better than a D rank for a while, somehow managing to glare at him as if he thought that he was the one to blame for Naruto's regression throughout the entire lecture. The lecture ended when the Hokage cut Iruka off by saying the team could have a C-ranked mission. He tried to push down the rising sense of dread that seemed to have come out of nowhere at the Hokage's declaration. A nice C-ranked mission would give Naruto a chance to stretch his legs and test his skills a bit while exploring a new environment. There was no reason to think they would get the same C rank twice, even if the thrice-damned mission to Wave had begun sometime around this time of this particular month the last time. Ruffling Naruto's hair fondly, he accepted the C rank. He stopped smiling behind his mask and his hand slid numbly to his side when the door slid open, revealing the absolute last person he had wanted to see. The second that drunken old bastard Tazuna showed up, he knew he should have stayed in bed today, or at the very least locked Naruto in his apartment where he'd be safe. "Oh shit," he said, knowing that there was no way he and, more importantly, Naruto could get out of this now. Unless he wanted to get into serious trouble, He could not reject a mission once accepted without giving a reasonable explanation. Telling the Hokage that the man was lying about the mission's ranking, and that he knew so because he had traveled through time would most likely result in a psych evaluation that would postpone the mission to wave indefinitely, since time travel was something that happened in crappy novels, not real life, but it would also result in him getting his team taken away from him as well. Who knew what damage a new Jonin instructor would do to Naruto's progress, or how many more people besides Naruto would be killed by Sasuke when he decided to leave Konoha? Probably much earlier this time around, because his instructor didn't have a neat assassination technique to teach him, or the knowledge of how to hold back the curse seal for the short time he had managed to do so when the kid had gotten it the last time around. He tried to console himself with the knowledge that Naruto had survived this mission the last time around, even though there had more close calls than he could count along the way. Actually, come to think of it, it had been the traitor Uchiha who had been the closest to being killed. Even with that warm thought though, he ended up failing as 100 doubts assailed him. Who knew what could go differently this time, especially since a little knowledge could be a dangerous thing, and if you changed one thing, you could end up changing everything. Would he act based on his memories of a fight that was somewhat fuzzy in his recollection now that he looked back on it, and change the outcome entirely, causing things to spiral out of control? Would his teaching his students something different because he'd already taught them the tree climbing exercise cause events to spiral off on a tangent that he couldn't predict? Would his students do something different because he'd treated and trained them differently, causing everything to go differently? Even if he did everything the same, there was no guarantee everything would turn out the same, and that worried him. He had to keep his team to keep Naruto safe in the future though. Right now, keeping his team meant keeping his silence for now and taking this mission despite the number of ways it could go foobar, while praying nothing went wrong this time the entire time they were gone, and turning back as soon as they faced the first of the enemy ninja, despite whatever heart-wrenching pleas the client, or former client rather, made. Naruto smiled as he prepared for the mission to wave. He would be able to tell Sasuke the truth about the Uchiha massacre after they arrived at the small island country. When he did, Sasuke wouldn't feel guilty for killing his brother this time around, because he either wouldn't kill his brother or would do so knowing that his brother wanted to die that way rather than slowly and painfully succumbing to an illness while he just as slowly went blind. If Sasuke didn't kill his brother, he wouldn't feel as angry at Konoha, and therefore probably wouldn't desire to destroy the place despite the fact that his brother had sacrificed everything to keep it standing. He would of course have to risk telling Sasuke about his time traveling to explain how he knew everything, but he was certain Sasuke could keep a secret better than most people as long as nobody got him drunk. "So, you're going on your first C rank?" Jiraiya said, poking his head into his room and smiling rather fondly as if he were recalling a pleasant memory from his youth. The slight wince that marred the Sannin's smile for a second was him undoubtedly reaching the point in the memory where Tsunade had most likely beaten the crap out of him. Either that, or the point at which Orochimaru had shown him up somehow. Jiraiya hadn't been able to catch a break with those two, but back before Tsunade broke and Orochimaru became a total headcase after the Second War, they had been an extremely close-knit team who'd loved each other the way only family who had chosen each other could. "Yes, Ero Sennin," he said as he continued packing extra weapons into a storage scroll. This C rank was going to be turning into an A rank pretty quickly, and he was going to be prepared this time. Hopefully, he would still be able to do some of the S-rank jutsus he'd learned before he went time traveling. His chakra control wasn't nearly as good as it had been back then, but he still remembered how to do all of the jutsu he'd learned over the years since he was last this age. "Come back safe," Jiraiya said, smiling, as he ruffled his hair before he turned to go back to writing his perverted book. Jiraiya usually did that for about half the day before he went out to train. After training, he would go to a previously agreed-upon bar to speak with one or more of his informants in order to gather intelligence on Orochimaru's movements. After staying at the bar gathering vital information for a while, he would usually either return or be dragged home in time for an exceedingly late dinner. All too soon, he'd finished packing to the sound of Jiraiya's perverted giggles. After he was reasonably certain that he had everything he needed and then some, he headed out to the gate where he was to meet the rest of his team and the old bridge builder Tazuna. Rather unexpectedly, Yamato Taicho was waiting for him at the gate, and there was a rather familiar-looking item in his hand. How in the hell did he get old lady Tsunade's necklace, and for that matter, why? Tenzo, who'd gotten a rather late start that morning after he'd fallen down a flight of stairs and hobbled to the hospital on a twisted ankle, had to practically kneel to put the first Hokage's necklace on Naruto because the boy was so short. Until now, he hadn't really realized it, but the kid had really shot up in the 3 years between now and when he first officially met him, as chasing him after some stupid prank because the police had been disbanded after the massacre didn't really count, since he'd never been the one to catch him. As he gave the boy the necklace that was rightfully his, he ignored the odd stare he was getting from Kakashi-senpai and the curious whispers that were coming from Naruto's teammates. "Now don't take this off, it's very special," he said when the boy started critically examining the necklace the instant he put it on him, most likely having serious doubts about whether or not he wanted to keep such a girly gift. He did his best not to be offended by this action though. Naruto had only started to learn proper manners rather late in life, and only then because the 5th Hokage had practically beaten them into him. "I'll tell you more, Abu," he continued, before he was blindsided by an angry Amino Iruka. "Stay away from Naruto," the man yelled before he socked him a second time. "Alright, fine, I'm leaving," he said, wanting to avoid a fight because he'd be unable to prevent Naruto from releasing the fox's power if he was put in the hospital by an overprotective Iruka. That man could pack a punch when he wanted to. He'd learned that the hard way when Naruto had offhandedly mentioned to the academy instructor that he had threatened to stick him in a cage during that rather disastrous mission where they had tried and failed to capture Sasori's spy Kabuto, who turned out to be a double agent in Orochimaru's camp. After Naruto had said that, Iruka hadn't waited to hear the rest of the story, which had involved him taking the team to an inn instead and had attacked him, giving him a black eye and a split lip before he could be subdued, despite the fact that he outranked and was theoretically stronger and faster than the Amino. As he left the area, he saw Iruka glaring at Kakashi-senpai, who ignored the man in favor of glaring at him, as if he'd done something wrong. He would find out why after he doubled back and followed Team Team 7 later. Kakashi-senpai could be pretty vicious at times, especially if you upset him for some unfathomable reason, and he wanted to get off of that man's bad side as quickly as possible as well. Tsunade watched as the young man who had tricked her into betting her necklace in a card game gave it to a boy who looked a little like a light blonde Nawaki. She had been tempted to run over to the child and snatch the necklace away before he could be killed but hadn't. Instead, she had watched as the boy vanished into the distance with his team on their way to who knows where. She had briefly thought of following after them, of warning the child about what he possessed, but she couldn't. She couldn't run the risk of seeing the boy die in front of her the way Dan had. Despite the fact that the child was only a few minutes away from the village, there were still numerous ways he could die. Shizune placed her hand on her shoulder in an attempt to comfort her. She knew something of what she was going through, as Dan had been her uncle. She also knew that she hated being back in Konoha, and didn't know what had possessed her to return. She herself honestly didn't know why she had continued following the man after where he was heading became obvious. As she stood there basking in the comfort her student provided, she wondered what she would have done without Shizune. Deciding to visit her former sensei before she went and got wasted so she could forget the face of the soon-to-be-dead child who was making his way down the road from Konoha, she turned and made her way to the Hokage Tower. "The blonde boy that looks like Nawaki?" the Hokage asked, wondering what Tsunade wanted with the child in question. He'd been both stunned and elated when Tsunade had shown up completely unannounced. The first question she asked once the pleasantries and small talk were over confused him briefly, as there were many young children in the village that may or may not have resembled Nawaki depending what characteristics one was looking for, and several of them were blonde. "The one with the orange top with the Uzumaki clan symbol on it," Tsunade replied, clarifying who she had been indicating. "Oh, you mean Naruto," he said, wondering how she had run into the village prankster who'd apparently made some sort of an impression. "What about him?" Moments after he answered her question, something seemed to click in Tsunade's mind. A brief look of horror crossed her face before it vanished. He would have to ask her about that later. "What can you tell me about him?" Tsunade asked, trying to hide some sort of painful emotion. "Besides what you already know. He's a lot like his mother was in personality and takes after her a bit in looks, despite having his father's coloring. He's hyperactive, likes pranks and ramen like his mother did, and is constantly telling everyone whether or not they want to hear it that he's going to be Hokage someday. I have a feeling that he might do it too." That boy never gives up when he sets his mind to something, which is both a good and a bad trait. He replied, wondering if that's what she wanted to hear. Tsunade looked sick. Before he could ask her what was wrong, she started sobbing. Damn him, damn him, damn him, damn him, Tsunade screamed. What is it, Tsunade? What's wrong? He asked. Some bastard tricked me into betting my necklace in a card game recently. He just gave it to Naruto less than 2 hours ago. Tsunade replied, looking both guilty and shaken at the same time. He didn't know what to say to that. He knew that several people including Tsunade believed the necklace to be cursed. The last 2 people that Tsunade had given the necklace to had died soon after receiving it. Both had been close to Tsunade in some way, and both had wanted to be Hokage. If someone thought they could kill Naruto by giving him a cursed object, they had another thing coming. Can you describe this man? He asked as he prepared an order for an Anbu team to go out and detain this individual. Kakashi felt his heart leap into his throat when Naruto started stomping and splashing in the puddle the rogue mist ninja were hiding in with a mischievous look on his face. He completely ignored Sakura's loud complaints as the chakra-tainted water splashed her, as they were completely important. About ready to panic, he jumped over and grabbed the boy, pulling him away from the puddle and its surely disoriented contents before he did the substitution jutsu as he had the last time, preparing for battle. The log was killed as it had been the first time, startling Sakura, Sasuke, and Tazuna. Instead of hanging back to see who his target was and how his students would fare against the enemy, he decided to leap back into the battle almost immediately. Before he could get into the thick of things, however, Naruto was already flying towards one of the demon brothers, and the other had somehow managed to get behind him. The eyes of the ninja behind Naruto widened almost comically. Holy shit, it's an Uzumaki, the demon brother behind Naruto yelled. The demon brothers then did something completely unexpected which completely wrecked his attack strategy before he could implement it. They turned tail and ran, each going in opposite directions. This had been all of the opening Naruto needed apparently, as he created about 24 clones and sent them after the brothers who returned 5 minutes later unconscious, being dragged by a pair of shadow clones each. As soon as they were back in the middle of the road, Naruto's shadow clones then proceeded to strip the pair of hapless ninja down to their underwear and bind them to a nearby tree while Naruto himself proceeded to haphazardly cram their equipment into a spare storage scroll that he had happened to be carrying. Naruto, what just happened? He asked confused. This had definitely not happened the last time around. The last time around, Naruto had frozen up and ended up getting himself poisoned. If it hadn't been for the Kyuubi, the boy would have been dead after that attack. Another question that came up was, why were the mist ninja afraid of Uzumaki? And if so, why hadn't they behaved that way last time this fight happened then if they were? I captured them, Naruto replied simply as he rolled up the now full storage scroll and put it away, both answering and not answering his question. Why'd they run like that? He asked, expecting to get a, hell if I know. In reply, and wondering why he'd even bothered wasting his breath asking. It had probably been the shock of seeing Naruto single-handedly catching a pair of Chunin-level missing nin that had made him start asking stupid questions. There's been a standing flee-on-sight order in Mist regarding the entire Uzumaki clan for the last 50 years. Naruto replied, not bothering to look up at him as he was busy snapping his pack shut. I found a note on it in the library when I tried researching my family recently. He stood there dumbfounded. Why hadn't any of the mist ninja they'd fought fled when they had faced Naruto the last time around? What was it that had made the difference this time? It was then that he remembered. The mist ninja had started yelling after he'd gotten behind Naruto, after he had seen the Uzumaki clan symbol on the boy's back. The last time around, Naruto had been wearing a rather hideous jumpsuit which had the symbol for Uzushogakure on it rather than the Uzumaki clan symbol. Since every Chunin and Junin vest and numerous articles of ninja clothing in Konoha had the exact same spiral sewn onto them or incorporated into their design, the ninja would not have found Naruto's to be significant, and wouldn't understand why he was wearing it despite it being rather non-standard amongst genin who usually wore their clan markings on their clothing if any. We're turning back, this mission has gone above C rank and is beyond your abilities to handle. He finally said once he'd returned from his musings. Despite the fact that Naruto seemed to be able to handle himself, and there was a chance that the demon of the mist might choose to run rather than fight this time, he wasn't going to risk it. They were going to turn around before Tazuna started on his sob story and reeled Naruto in. He would probably feel guilty for a long time for allowing Gato to keep his stranglehold on Wave, but he'd feel even guiltier if he let Naruto get hurt. In the balance between virtual strangers and his sensei's son, Naruto came first. No, Naruto howled, his blue eyes flashing in anger in a manner that was reminiscent of his father, despite his response being more something his mother would do. We started this mission and we had to finish it. Besides, I defeated these guys all by myself. And, what if we end up facing a much stronger opponent? He asked, hoping that the boy would see his logic. If they're from Mist, it probably wouldn't matter. Naruto replied, smirking at having come up with an appropriate comeback. Point taken, he said, knowing that he'd end up losing this argument with Naruto like this as he was as persistent as both of his parents combined. And he'd never won an argument with Minato-sensei. The swordsman Momochi Zabuza had been from Mist, and even missing Nin tended to follow Flea on side orders since they knew that they were put in place for a reason. But there was still the possibility that the Momochi could harm Naruto before he even noticed that he was an Uzumaki. Then, on the other hand, there was the fact that Naruto had survived the last time around. That, and he probably wouldn't forgive him if he ever learned that he'd had the chance to save a whole bunch of people and hadn't been able to because he'd been turned back by an overprotective teacher. He knew full well that he wouldn't be able to stand looking into Minato-sensei's disappointed blue eyes every day for years, even if they were in someone else's face. He would just have to make sure that Naruto wasn't injured, even if it meant locking him in a trunk at the first available opportunity. Great, he'd just done all of Naruto's arguing for him, and the kid still won. Fine, I'll just send a message back to Konoha informing them of our prisoners and we'll move out. He said, defeated. If he'd known that signing up for the Tora capture mission in the hopes that the Uchiha would be scratched to hell and back by the damn beast when he was forced to carry it back to the Hokage Tower would result in this, he'd have taken that babysitting job that involved the pair of brats that had sent the last 10 of their babysitters running for the hills instead. Naruto smiled as they set off down the road to Wave. Instead of panicking, freezing up, getting poisoned, panicking again and cutting his own hand open, he had handled himself admirably. That, and the irrational fear that the Mist had towards the Uzumaki who had become some sort of bogeyman to them over the years was finally working out for him. The last time around, he'd somehow been marked down as, not an Uzumaki, and the Flea on side order had been disregarded in his case. It probably had something to do with the fact that he'd generally been the loser in the fights he'd had with the few shinobi from Mist that he had faced, hadn't killed his other opponents in a creative and rather embarrassing manner, sucked at seals, and didn't have the dark red hair that had been the trademark of the Uzumaki for generations. Whistling, he made his way over to Tazuna. He was planning on asking him about the conditions in Wave so the others could be informed, since Kakashi hadn't interrogated him this time around, and therefore hadn't forced him to spill his sad tale. Are you really an Uzumaki? Tazuna asked, looking at him strangely. Yep, on my mother's side. He replied cheerfully. He'd initially been resentful of the possible implication that he had been a bastard but, since he learned who his father was, and how the little ruse had kept his father's enemies, especially almost the whole of Iwa, from pounding him into the dirt or killing him, he'd become much less so. That, and he was still a bit pissed at his father for sealing that damn fox inside him. Forgiven didn't exactly mean forgotten. You don't have a weird obsession with sticking things up people's butts, do you? Tazuna asked, still giving him that strange look. No, why? He asked, completely puzzled by the question. After all, why would he be obsessed with sticking things up people's butts? He wasn't a pervert of any sort. Well, not much of one at least. The Oiroke Jutsu was an anti-pervert move. Honest. Tazuna looked immensely relieved by his response. A moment later, he started mumbling something under his breath. What are you doing? He asked. Thanking the gods that you take after your father's side of the family. Tazuna replied. You sent him where? Jiraiya said, almost unable to believe his ears. He'd interrupted his writing to come to the Hokage's office because his former sensei had sent him a message indicating that something might be wrong with his godson. When he arrived, he learned that things weren't going as well as they could have been and Naruto had yet again been sent on that A-rank mission that had been disguised as AC rank. On a mission to guard a bridge builder from Wave from bandits. The Hokage replied calmly after briefly looking at his notes. Despite the fact that he'd wished for the answer to change, It had been what he'd heard the first time. Due to some extremely bad luck and factors he'd had no control over, the boy had been sent on a mission that had greatly traumatized him the last time around, again. If he knew that it would even have been possible after all of the little changes that had been made, he would have gone out looking for that damned bridge builder and turned him away from Konoha or gone to Wave and dealt with things himself. It had never really occurred to him that the changes he'd made had mostly been local, and wouldn't really have had all that much effect on things that were outside of the village, except that an informant that had been killed shortly after meeting with him the last time around had survived because that particular meeting had never taken place. What bearing would Naruto no longer living in a crap heap of an apartment, Naruto getting attention from Kakashi, Iruka becoming paranoid about pedophiles and eventually catching a few, the other Jonin believing the Uchiha might be a danger to their students and refusing joint training exercises for that reason rather than because Naruto was on the team really have on when an old man in another country decides to set out in an attempt to get some ninja on the cheap so he could complete a bridge that a shipping magnate was attempting to prevent since it would cut into his profits? Any one of the Genin teams or even a team of Chunin could have drawn that mission. It was just Naruto's bad luck that he'd been there at the right place at the right time once more, and he would just have to hope that the mission went the same as it had the last time around, or a bit better, and be there for Naruto when he returned. There was little else he could do really since he was already a day behind them and would be extremely late to any of the battles they would face on the road to Wave. Tenzo gaped at the pair of missing nin that had been tied to a rather large oak wearing only their headbands, underwear and socks. Since he was less than an hour behind Team 7, whichever battle these shinobi had fought and apparently lost had taken place recently. Since there wasn't any blood on the ground, he could only conclude that besides the mist ninja who were bound to the tree apologizing profusely and thanking somebody for something, nobody had been injured. "What happened to you?" he asked. "We dared to go up against an Uzumaki," they said. "And?" he asked. "Uzumaki-sama was merciful. He only stripped us and robbed us," the one on the left said. Tenzo could only stare after that proclamation. Naruto had stripped them and robbed them, and they considered that merciful? When the men had gone back to apologizing for every bad thing they had ever done and swearing that they wouldn't do it again, he was back on more familiar ground. Naruto could get a mass murderer to change his ways in under an hour. He seemed to have set a new personal record with these guys though. The boat trip to Wave was pretty much the same as he remembered it being the last time. Sasuke, who was probably going through withdrawal rather than being hung over since Kakashi had confiscated all of his alcohol, was staring out at the mist as if it had personally insulted him. Sakura was trying to rub up against Sasuke who kept pushing her away. Kakashi was reading one of his favorite novels in the Icha Icha series, and quietly giggling at the particularly dirty parts. And Tazuna was aftwards quietly chatting with the skipper who was quietly rowing the boat towards the shore since the motor would have been too loud. There was one small problem with him himself however. A problem he'd noticed the morning after they'd left Konoha. A problem he'd completely overlooked until he'd mentally reviewed his day wondering why he'd had the nagging feeling that something was missing. Kakashi had forgotten his pills this time around, which was bad, since if the meds in his system slipped below a certain level, they'd completely clear out of his system far more quickly than normal, causing a large number of problems. Remembering the disaster that had occurred when Jiraiya had decided he didn't need the medication he'd been taking since before he could remember during their training trip, he hoped that it wouldn't turn out to be a complete disaster. They couldn't afford one considering what would be happening soon. By this point, the medication in his bloodstream had slipped well below therapeutic levels, and he was already beginning to feel the results. The worse than usual twitchiness, which was the first sign that things would be going south soon, had already started. He felt like he had a lot more energy than usual, and he was rapidly losing focus as just about everything from the way the boatman smelled to the cry of the gull wheeling overhead caught his attention. If things went the way they had the last time he'd been off his meds, he'd literally be bouncing off the walls, unable to focus on anything for more than 2 seconds by midday tomorrow, if not sooner. Back before, old lady Tsunade had once told him that he suffered from what appeared to be an extremely severe form of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder that had most likely been caused by the much larger than usual amounts of chakra in his system thanks to the tenant in his belly that gave him more energy in a minute than a normal person had in a month. The meds had helped keep this under control to the degree that, while he was on them, he appeared to suffer from a normal case of ADHD that had gone untreated. Without the meds however, He hoped there was a pharmacy in Wave, otherwise, Kakashi and the rest of the team were in for an interesting time. Kakashi had been quietly reading when Tazuna had made a comment that heralded disaster. "What's wrong with him?" Tazuna asked as he gestured to a rather squirmier than usual Naruto. He looked at his watch. Was it already that late? Damn, the kid should have had his meds hours ago. Come to think of it, when was the last time he'd given the boy his meds? Reaching into a specific pocket on his vest, he pulled out a small pill bottle. It was empty. That's right, he'd planned to go to the pharmacy for a refill, but they got the mission to Wave and he'd been too distracted thinking of the many ways it could go wrong to do so. Iruka had told him not to cut it so close with Naruto's meds and to get a refill when there were 15 pills left in the bottle, but he just didn't listen. "Ah shit," he said as he remembered what Naruto was like before he'd started the meds. Kakashi nervously followed the nurse down the corridors of the hospital. As he did so, he wondered why he had the gall to think that he would succeed where medical professionals with decades of experience had failed. It was probably because he had actually cared about Naruto's fate, and the hospital staff had only been caring for the boy because the Hokage had ordered them to do so. "He's in here," the nurse said as she opened a heavy steel door, revealing a thickly padded room. A bright yellow blur that he'd been assured was really a 2-year-old boy flashed by, appearing to be moving somewhere near the speed of light. The blur, or rather boy in question, was bouncing off of every wall of the padded room, including the floor and ceiling, faster than even his Sharingan eye could track. His mission was to get this kid to sit still long enough to swallow the pill that one of the doctors had provided, since all other methods of administering medication to the child had failed. Naruto had absolutely refused to get within 15 feet of a needle after he'd been caught in a net by a hunter nin who'd been hired for the occasion, and given his vaccination several months ago, and had been far too young for this particular medication at that time. Adding to the problem was the fact that the child always seemed to know when the food given to him was laced with sedatives, and would accordingly refuse to eat it. After Naruto had gotten rather dangerously thin, the hospital's medical staff had been forced to cease their attempts at sedation. If he failed in this task, Minato-sensei's son, who seemed to live up to the name Yellow Flash without using special seals, would probably be forced to live in that padded room for the rest of his short life, which the doctors had informed the Hokage wouldn't last longer than a few more years if he continued the way he was going, since the human body couldn't handle the stress that the boy was putting it through, even with the freakish healing and regenerative abilities he had. The doctors and nurses had attempted to administer medication to Naruto while he was asleep, but the boy only slept for about a minute at a time before he started bouncing off the walls for hours on end, as he had been doing ever since he learned to walk once more. By the time the hospital staff reached the room with the child's medication, Naruto would have already woken up, and was damn near impossible to catch while he was awake. The hunter nin who'd used the net in order to capture Naruto so he could receive his vaccinations was on medical leave for mental health reasons, since he'd been unable to do anything other than sit in a corner and rock back and forth after that mission. If the rumors he'd heard were true, Naruto's eyes had turned red and the boy had grown claws and fangs which he had then used to bite and scratch the hell out of the poor man when he turned the child loose in his room after the vaccinations had been administered. Nobody else had been able to hold onto the child long enough to administer medication, much less catch him in a net as the hunter nin had done since then. The one who'd come closest to doing so had been Morino Ibiki during the infamous stuffed duck incident 2 months ago, and he had ended up coming away from said incident with a large number of nasty-looking scratches on his arms that looked like they were going to scar. Because of that, Jiraiya had been ordered to clearly label all of Naruto's birthday presents as such and send them through the mail properly in order to prevent another misunderstanding such as the one that had led to the stuffed duck incident from occurring. He hoped his plan worked. Otherwise, the doctors and maybe even the Hokage would give up hope of the child that Minato-sensei had sacrificed so much for ever living anything approaching a normal life. After watching the boy bounce off the walls for over an hour, he was reasonably certain that he'd found a pattern in the boy's movements. Hoping that he was correct and that neither he nor the boy suffered any broken bones or other injuries as a result of bringing the child to such an abrupt halt from the speed he'd been moving it, he moved to knock the boy out of the air. Upon landing on the floor, Naruto was stunned for a second. It was all the time he needed. He pinned the boy and forced him to swallow the pill he'd been given. Before the child could spit it up, he shoved a chocolate into the boy's mouth and hoped he didn't choke. That apparently did the trick, since the boy became busy chewing and swallowing the chocolate, completely forgetting about the pill. After a while, the medication seemed to take effect. Naruto's bouncing became much slower than it had been before. Instead of being somewhere near the speed of light, he looked to be traveling at about the speed of sound. He probably wasn't though, since there weren't any sonic booms. After his initial success, he got called in every morning for the next week to give the child his medication. By the time it had reached what the doctors had determined to be therapeutic levels, Naruto was merely moving at the rate of an overly hyperactive toddler and actually sleeping for hours at a time rather than minutes. Fortunately, considering the young age at which Naruto had started his medication, the healing and regeneration that had been caused by the fox supercharging his Uzumaki traits had eliminated any of the numerous possible negative side effects. After a month, Naruto was able to be released into the care of one of the local orphanages. "Is there a pharmacy in Wave?" he asked Tazuna when his flashback had ended, praying the answer was yes because he hadn't seen one the last time around. The last time he and his students had been in Wave, he hadn't needed to visit the pharmacy because he'd gotten Naruto's prescription filled in Konoha at the last minute. This time however, yes, but it is controlled by Gato. The man has a stranglehold on almost every business in Wave, the hospital included. The medicine sold at the pharmacy is priced higher than almost anyone can afford. Tazuna said, scowling as his thoughts took a rather dark turn. "When I finish my bridge, Gato will no longer have a stranglehold on everything and people will finally be able to afford such basic things as food and medicine." He sighed in relief at this, and silently prayed that the pharmacy in Wave had the medication he needed, and that Naruto would be able to hold out until then. But considering the fact that Naruto was running around in circles by the time the boat docked, he wasn't certain he would. Sakura watched in confusion as Naruto raced so far ahead of the group that she could barely see him and then ran back several times. Naruto had calmed down a bit since they'd left the academy, but, right now, he was being even more of a spaz than usual. After racing back to the group yet again, Naruto started running around them in circles instead. "Don't worry, Tazuna, I'll protect you. You can build your bridge, then everyone'll be happy," Naruto chattered as he ran around Tazuna before he got distracted by something in the bushes. "There's a rabbit around here." "I know there is. I like rabbits. Rabbits are cute and fluffy," Naruto babbled as he raced off into said bushes, presumably in search of the rabbit. When Naruto returned from the woods carrying a frightened white rabbit, she attempted to smack him over the head for not only breaking formation but scaring the crap out of the poor woodland creature as well. Instead of allowing the blow to land, Naruto dodged her in a move that was faster than she could see, however. "Turn that poor rabbit loose, Naruto," she yelled. "Can't you see how scared it is?" "Why? I TTTs mean," Naruto yelled as Kakashi told them all to duck. A half second after she and the rest of the team except Naruto, who sprung at least 30 feet into the air still clutching the hapless rabbit, ducked, a gigantic sword went sailing over their heads or, as in Naruto's case, beneath their feet and embedded itself into a tree. When she looked up at the massive blade, there was a fearsome-looking man standing on it looking down at them, and Kakashi-sensei was standing in front of the rest of the team preparing himself for battle. "Hey Mr. Momochi, I forgot it's your rabbit, can I keep it?" Naruto said, speaking faster than a 2-year-old on speed that has eaten a pound of sugar as he held up the rabbit that looked like it was about to have a heart attack. The man looked down at Naruto in confusion for a moment. The confusion rapidly turned to shock. Zabuza looked over at the group of genin led by the copy ninja Kakashi that were guarding his target. He couldn't help but do a double take at the blonde one who was holding up his decoy rabbit and asking if he could keep it. Whose bright idea had it been to dress the kid like a toddler? Taking a look at the clan marking on the boy's back that he could just barely see from his vantage point, he realized that he shouldn't have been surprised. There was a reason for the flee-on-sight order when it came to that particular clan. The entire Uzumaki family, as well as being incredibly skilled with seals, was both highly dangerous and batshit insane. The 7 swordsmen of the mist had learned that the hard way 50 years ago when the swords were passed down to the next generation rather earlier than expected after one of the blonde boy's relatives had defeated all 7 of them and shoved their swords where the sun didn't shine. When he was drunk, his former master would claim that he was still finding bits of rectum on his sword. "Haku, we're getting the fuck out of here," he yelled. Had it been just that one incident, he probably would have stood and fought, but, He had grown up hearing stories that he had desperately tried to forget. Ordinarily, he could handle tales of blood and gore, but blood, gore, silly string, and a prank jutsu that had deadly results for the S-class ninja that got caught in it. And the one that had pulled that off had just been a genin like the blonde brat whose parents apparently hadn't yet realized he wasn't 3 anymore. Why? Haku called back, hidden in some trees. They have an Uzumaki with them, that's why, he yelled back. Haku didn't need to be told twice. Like everyone else in Water Country, he'd grown up hearing the stories. An instant after he'd answered the boy's question, he flew out of the tree in which he'd been hiding and made his break for it across the water, with him trailing a few feet behind after having barely taken the time to pull his sword from the tree. That had been one hell of a close call. It seemed that nobody had seen fit to warn anyone in Kiri that the Uzumaki clan hadn't been entirely wiped out by Kumo and Iwa. However unlikely as that was, now that he thought about it, as reported, since there were obviously some survivors left living in Konoha who were mixing with their population if the hyper-blonde was any indication. Though he had absolutely no loyalty to the Mizukage, he was going to rectify that situation immediately. As he raced across the water intent on putting the Uzumaki as far behind him as he could, cries of, "Hey! Hey, Mr. Momochi, can I keep the rabbit? Can I keep the rabbit?" started to come from a few feet behind him. Fearing what he would see when he looked behind him, he turned around while still running until he was running backwards. The Uzumaki boy had followed him and was still holding the little snow rabbit of Haku's that he'd used as a decoy. The rabbit was still alive, but it was now looking a little worse for wear. He would make it up to Haku later, but now. Yes, now, go away, he yelled, hoping and praying that the boy would leave him alone as soon as he got what he wanted, and knowing he wouldn't be so lucky. Okay. Thanks, bye, the blonde Uzumaki boy yelled as he turned around and made his way back to his team, who were standing on shore staring at him in open-mouthed shock. Stunned, and almost unable to believe that his stupid plan had actually worked, he tripped and fell into the water he'd been running across. Haku ran back and hauled him back out, and a second later they were running once more. THSTA all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.